Chapter 1503. Behemoths walk in the northern wilderness, guarding the secrets of the ancient land. The crystal clusters were coming from all directions. Hippamra stood in the middle of the hill, her face fearless. She took a step back and slapped the ground with her hand. The silver stone gauntlet covering her right arm turned into water and flowed into the ground, forming a huge magic circle. A deafening roar came from the mountain path, and the ground shook. A rune stone colossus broke out from the ground. This elemental creature violently swept its hand, and the crystal clusters that were charging at the front immediately fell off the cliff or were sent flying into the air, shattering into pieces. Secret stone armor. 20 cost colorless divine equipment, +6/+6 equip. When equipped with this equipment, the creature has the ability of immortality. Shuffle this equipment into the graveyard, search for a creature whose cost does not exceed this card, and put it into play. The power of the 88 runestone colossus was almost equivalent to a creature at the peak of elemental activation, and it controlled the highest elemental stone, earth. It roared into the sky, and countless stone spikes sprouted out of the ground like bamboo shoots after a rain. The purple sea above the mountain path was emptied. But Hippamra did not slack off. Stone! She ordered her summoned creature to put down its arm, and rushed along its arm all the way to the top of the colossus' head. She jumped up high, and when she landed, her feet touched the sharp rocks. The earth seemed to listen to the command of the priestess, and pushed her forward like a wave, passing over the heads of the crystal clusters. Just as she passed by the area, a purple flash appeared behind her, and a giant crystal cluster behemoth fell out of the rift created by the teleportation, and fell into this world. Be careful of the secret crystal lords, they are proficient in long-range attacks. You better hurry, there are more of them. The huge shadow of the seven-poled dragon king, Fuchsia, covered half the sky, and hovered between the peaks, almost as tall as the entire sacred mountain. 7 long horns pierced the sky, and she raised her head and gave a warning. Several purple arcs of light had already streaked across the valley, piercing through the runestone colossus. Hippamra revealed the last artifact card in her hand. Sacred Artifact of Transference, negate all protection. Counterattack when any player casts a spell and add a transference counter to the sacred artifact. When the counter reaches 3, remove the transference counter and sacrifice it. Search your deck for an artifact card, put it onto the battlefield, and equip it on a creature you control. Then shuffle your deck. The arcs of light hit a pale white light barrier. Then, the same number of arcs of light shot out from the light barrier at the same time, flying towards their origin. A few secret crystal lords were immediately devoured by the grayish-white flames, turning into a pile of gray powder in an instant. Hippamra had just landed on the ground, and the many crystal clusters behind her had already turned into fragments. She raised her hand, and the runestone colossus in the center of the battlefield let out a wail and fell to the ground. Under the attack of the many crystal clusters, it shattered into pieces. However, a beam of white light shot out from its wreckage, crossing half of the battlefield in an arc and landing in the hands of the priestess. It was a huge sword burning with blazing white flames. When the runestone colossus enters the graveyard, search the graveyard for an artifact card, put it onto the battlefield, and equip it on a creature you control. It was the Tianming sword. 22 cost, colorless artifact. The creature wearing this artifact gets +2/+2 and has anti-white protection and anti-black protection abilities. Whenever the creature wearing this artifact deals combat damage to the target, its owner gains 3 HP, and you can transfer up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Hippamra held the sacred sword in her hand, and her strength was close to the late stage of the elemental enlightenment after the buff. At the same time, the sacred artifact of transference in the air had turned into a pool of silver liquid. It changed its shape and formed a set of silver armor that covered her body. Ancient silver armor, the creature wearing this artifact gets +6/+6. Whenever the creature wearing this artifact attacks, the target non-lord creature will be destroyed. The peak of the sacred mountain was already in sight. Hippamra raised her head, knowing that the final battle was in front of her. A huge creature was taking shape. It was a huge whale that cruised through the mountains. Its huge fins could cover half the mountainside, and its gray skin was covered with tumor-like crystalline protrusions. On its spindle-shaped head, a long crystal horn pointed towards the sky. The Leviathan's heir. Although it was not the true Lord of Chaos, it was the most powerful of all the lords. Facing such a monster, even Hippamra could not help but change her expression. Why would there be such a creature in this place? Countless crystal shards fell from the sky, and the moment these crystals left the body of the whale, they turned into countless crystal worms. These were the Kaigure crystal worms, the vanguard of the crystal worm army. They attacked as soon as they took shape. These monsters were not powerful, but their numbers were shocking. Hippamra looked up. Half the sky was an eye-catching purple-red, like a flowing crystal river. She took a step back and waved her hand. A shining silver eagle immediately shot out from her hand and into the clouds. A moment later, pieces of silver light fell from the clouds, whistling through the sky. It was a group of silver eagles, swooping down from the clouds. Eagle Squadron. When the Eagle Squadron enters the battlefield, you can search your deck for up to 3 cards named Eagle Squadron. Reveal these cards, place them in your hand, and shuffle your deck. The huge group of eagles was like a silver arrow that stretched across the sky. It made a huge turn in the air, and then bit down on the purple-red river. The giant eagles and the Kaigure crystal worms fought each other, and the two sides clashed, causing corpses to fall like rain. After the torrent of amethysts in the sky was split by the silver arrow, it formed 2 thin lines that crossed Hippamra. Although there were still crystal worms that whistled past her head from time to time, these weak creatures could not pose any threat to the priestess. Hippamra gripped the Tianming sword tightly. With the support of the ancient silver armor, her current strength was infinitely close to the pinnacle state. Those fishes that slipped through her net were nothing more than dust to her. With a sweep of her giant sword, they were reduced to ashes. Hippamra continued to release the Eagle Squadron as she advanced, although there were only 4 Eagle Squadrons in a deck. However, the Tianming sword's ability to return to the graveyard continuously pulled them back to the battlefield. Very quickly, she was already extremely close to the giant whale. "Keep going," Fuchsia's voice boomed from the sky. "Behind that monster is the peak of the sacred mountain. The core of the legacy lies within the sacred temple." Without saying a word, Hippamra stepped onto the edge of the cliff. She swung her sword and hacked the crystal cluster that was pouncing at her face, then leaped up and spread out a pair of metal wings behind her. It was a divine artifact creature, a vibrator. She grabbed the frame of the vibrator and slowly glided towards the giant whale in the valley. The descendant of the Leviathan seemed to have sensed her intentions. It let out a low roar and swung its tail towards Hippamra. However, as soon as the vibrator flew up, it barely missed the whale's tail. However, the airflow brought about by the whale's tail caused her to fly up and down. Hippamra had no choice but to let go of the vibrator and land heavily on the back of the giant whale from a height of a few hundred meters. The Leviathan was neither dead nor alive, but legend had it that its race was always alone. In the boundless sea of chaos, ever since the beginning of the world, only one Leviathan had ever been born. It was the true ruler of chaos. It had the ability to imprison all powers, elements and energy. Even elements and laws themselves would be locked down. The offspring of Leviathan, or rather, the projection of the behemoth in the material world, did not have this ability, but it was enough to make most of the elements lose their effects. There was also an anti-magic area around its huge body, which was dozens of miles wide. The spells of mortals could not work here at all. But there was only one ability that the creatures of chaos could never control. And that was the power of a planeswalker. Every planeswalker comes from a legacy. There will never be more or less planeswalkers in this world. Different legacies may be absent in a certain era, but they will one day reappear in this world. One of the legacies has been absent for a long time, but I can see the same flame and light in you. Hippamra raised her sword and let out a roar as she thrust it towards the central nervous system of the Leviathan. The sacred swordsman did not even manage to penetrate the crystalline layer of the Leviathan's descendant's back, but the planeswalker's flames had already burned through its entire body. The Leviathan roared and shook its body. The crystals on its back that looked like lumps fell off like mountains, revealing the smooth surface underneath. The priestess shouted again. It was hard to believe that such a quiet lady could make such a wild shout. She threw out a Phyrexia Metamorphosis demon. This terrifying creature could become a replica of any divine artifact or creature on the battlefield. Hippamra caught the Phyrexia Metamorphosis demon and turned it into another Tianming sword. Then she swung it down heavily. With another boost, Hippamra's power level had risen to the middle of the Supreme Realm in an instant. This slash caused the skin on the Leviathan's descendant's back to split open, but it did not bleed. Only gray mist gushed out from the wound. This time, the whale's roar was more like a wail. Under the intense pain, it crashed into the sacred mountain. A bright green net of light appeared from the front to the back of the mountain where the storm stopped. When the giant beast collided with the net, a miracle happened. Its entire body shattered like a crystal, instantly shattering into pieces. The power of imprisonment that shrouded the entire valley disappeared in an instant. Hippamra immediately felt the Supreme Realm returning to her body. She fell from the Leviathan's descendant's back, but now she could finally stabilize herself. The last obstacle had disappeared. The Keeger crystals that were flying in the air were flying around like headless flies, but the priestess ignored them. She flew against the cold wind towards the sacred temple. But at this time, the towering mountain of ceasing storms suddenly turned into a mist. The cold wind disappeared, and the surroundings seemed to have fallen into a dark space. Hippamra felt her feet touch solid ground in the next moment. She was stunned for a moment before she saw the mist in front of her. And in front of her, there was a golden card floating in the darkness. Looking at the card, Hippamra seemed to understand something. She silently walked up and reached out to the card. But the next moment, what she held in her hand was not a card. It was a sharp sword that was entwined with black and green light. The Sword of Fengling. 21 cost colorless divine equipment. Creatures who wear this equipment will gain +2/+2 and have anti-black and anti-green protection. Whenever a creature wearing this equipment causes combat damage to an enemy, all lands under your control will be reset. This sword, when Hippamra saw the sword, she could not help but be stunned. In the darkness, Fuchsia's figure appeared. She had transformed into a black-haired woman wearing a black robe and a crown. Her appearance could not be said to be beautiful, but it was so majestic that it was suffocating. Especially that pair of eyes that burned with golden flames. You should recognize it. This is the Sword of Famine, Lorenshir, the divine equipment of Himmelud. But it also has another origin. When the Azure Knight called out the names of Himmelud and Gaia in the mountains and searched for the Azure Lance, it was the goddess who gave him this sword. It was not for him to break through all the obstacles and finally gain the favor of the heavens. Fuchsia quietly narrated, but it is not just a sword, but a legacy. It is very different from the Truth Society and the Arbiters. The Planeswalker legacy of the Azure Knight comes from the organization of Gaia. It is a rare Planeswalker legacy with the duty of guarding. Since the era of the Azure Knight, it has not had a second successor, until today. This is my Planeswalker legacy? Hippamra asked with a little surprise. She repeatedly observed the sword in her hand. It was the sacred item of the goddess she worshipped. Everything was so compatible. It is called the Majestic Mountain Armament. It is a set of rare equipment cards. Not only can it protect you, but it can also protect your Planeswalker master. Its power, I believe you have already experienced it. Fuchsia replied. Can I take it with me? Of course, it is already yours. Hippamra took a while to calm down. She silently turned the sword into a golden card, and then watched the card disappear in her hand. She was wounded all over. Her face, her body, were all red with blood. The wounds were painful, but at this moment, her heart was unusually calm. Some of the things that she believed in were like towering mountains that reached into the clouds, possessing a broad and comforting power. Hippamra raised her head. There were still some doubts in her heart. The crystal clusters that appeared in the illusion did not seem to be real projections. Especially the few Lord-class creatures that appeared at the end, their power was obviously incompatible with the illusions she encountered at the beginning of the illusion. What happened outside? Where is Metisha? She will be out in a moment. Fuchsia answered. Before she finished speaking, the silhouette of the silver elf princess appeared in the darkness. Hippamla couldn't help but widen her eyes. What she saw was a head full of long hair that flowed down to her ankles, so beautiful that it made people jealous. The elf princess was barefooted, her silver eyes empty. She held a silver spear in her hands and was in a daze. Metisha. The priestess did not dare to recognize her. In the past, Metisha looked like a young princess, but now, she looked like an elegant goddess. Fuchsia gently pressed Hippamra's shoulder. Don't disturb her. She is not like you. She used to be an undead. The Planeswalker's legacy has completely changed her nature. You mean, Miss Metisha has truly come back to life? Hippamra asked excitedly. If the Lord knew about this, he would be overjoyed. It's much more complicated than that. A Planeswalker's power doesn't matter if she's dead or alive. She nodded in the end. But you can basically say that she's a real Planeswalker like you. Miss Divine Official couldn't help but take a deep breath, revealing a happy smile. At this time, Metisha finally snapped out of her daze. Her ethereal eyes regained their luster. She noticed the changes in her body and subconsciously looked at her hands. When she saw that her pure white fingertips were no longer that intimidating snow white, and that her sparkling skin revealed a trace of healthy red color, tears involuntarily slid down her cheeks. Metisha wiped her tears and turned around. Lady Fuchsia, why did the dusk species appear in this place? They are not projections, right? Hippamla couldn't help but be startled. She didn't expect Metisha to encounter a dusk species. Could it be that the monsters in the illusion were not illusions? She subconsciously looked at Fuchsia. The Seven Dragon King nodded. That is indeed the case. Did something happen outside, Lord Dragon King? Take a look for yourselves. Fuchsia waved her hand, and a large crystal ball appeared in the darkness. She tapped on the crystal ball, and all kinds of images appeared on it. Hippamra and Metisha recognized that it was the scenery outside the elemental boundary. There was a shallow sea, a scorching river, and even a mountain where the storm stopped. However, these places were no longer the same as before. The shallow sea was torn apart by a powerful force, and the water elemental and seawater were flowing into the void. Part of the seawater flowed into the scorching river, causing the fire elemental realm to be engulfed in a sea of mist. At the bottom of the elemental realm, the scorching river had dried up, and the lava had cooled to a black color. The mountain where the storm stopped seemed to have broken down from the middle. The wind elemental wyverns that once lived here were nowhere to be seen. The shattered mountain range floated in the void. As for the wind, it had stopped long ago. Only purple lightning could be seen flashing between the gray, lifeless rocks. Since the fall of the Black Moon, the elemental realm had long collapsed. The creatures that used to live in the elemental realm, especially the fairies and other elemental creatures, had long fled to the inner world. It was a well-known fact that the elemental realm had become a cage that sealed the dusk dragon. However, Hippamra and Metisha did not understand why Fuchsia showed them this thing. Medisha frowned. She looked at it for a while and noticed something strange. "Where's the yellow dusk dragon?" she asked. "Isn't it there?" "My lord and sage Eloranta personally sealed it in that place." Hippamra suddenly stopped talking. She could not see anything in front of her. "The dusk dragon has broken the seal." Medisha suddenly thought of a terrifying possibility, but she still could not believe it. "That seal can bind it for at least 3 years, right? How can this be?" "Don't worry, its body has not completely left," Fuchsia shook her head and replied, "but someone has once again awakened its body in the material realm." "Humph, there are really countless moles among the mortals, Miss Roman." Medisha suddenly remembered something and could not help but exclaim. Although the dusk dragon's body was sealed outside the elemental realm, its other body, the merchant lady, had always been in the material realm. Everyone had neglected this fact. "Can you find her, Dragon King?" Hippamra could not help but ask anxiously. No one wanted to see the dusk dragon roaming the world without fear, even though the merchant lady herself did not have much power. This time, Fuchsia shook her head and replied, "Since she has sneaked into our world, it is obvious that she will not let us find out so easily. But the dusk species you encountered before is indeed related to this matter." She pointed outside the elemental realm and said, "Although I do not know what this fellow is up to, the sea of chaos has begun to stir. The dusk army is attacking Wone from all directions without any regard for the cost. With this level of attack, the forces of chaos that have infiltrated the elemental realm are not small. We are only the beginning. I believe that the continent has already turned upside down. Then we must return to my lord's side immediately." Medisha immediately reacted, "Erwin might be in trouble too." Hearing this, Hippamla immediately nodded her head, obviously eager to return home. Fuchsia looked at the two of them and hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded. "It seems that it is necessary. In a sense, you are my students. I will go with you." Chapter 1504. November, the month of frost. Cold winds howled across the grassland. Grass was withered, and snow was falling like goose feathers. This year's winter was particularly difficult for the lion men of Toquinin. The failure of the expedition, the endless internal strife, the various clan leaders shirked their responsibilities and argued with each other. Some areas in the south and west were rumored to have fallen into eternal night. Large numbers of cattle and sheep died in the snowstorm, and refugees came from all directions, making the situation even worse. It was as warm as spring in the thick leather tent. A bright flame burned on the matchstick, making a crackling sound. Sparks occasionally rose and climbed up the dark bottom of the pot. A lamb rib was cooking in the pot. A thick layer of oil was bubbling on top of the meat. The air was filled with the aroma of meat mixed with the aroma of plant tubers. Nair's eyes were a little dazed. The way the lion people counted the years was slightly different from other civilizations. Due to the lack of farming culture, they divided the two most important seasons of the year by the withering and flourishing of the plants on the grassland. 1 year passed when the plants on the grassland withered and the other flourished. That seemed to be something that happened not too long ago. It was the season of the year when the vegetation was the most flourishing. The clansmen were in high spirits, and he had just completed his coming-of-age ceremony. He had tied his pure white mane into a hair whip and wholeheartedly wanted to become the greatest warrior of the lion clan. Just like his ancestors, he wanted to reclaim Toquinin's long-lost honor. At that time, everything seemed to be going in the best direction. But in the blink of an eye, they had lost everything. He had lost his childhood playmate, his father, and many other people close to him. The lion beast men of Toquinin, on the other hand, had their spines broken. They could not stand up again. This harsh winter had brought disaster to the clan. The lion man Xiaonan was confused. Toquinin had lost its glory. When would they be able to take it back? Nair, Nair. The person beside him reminded him in a low voice. Only then did Nair come back to his senses. The tent was bustling with activity. The leaders of 7 or 8 clans surrounded the 3 humans, their green eyes filled with evil intentions. The atmosphere in the tent was tense. The human knight had his hand on the hilt of his sword, looking alert. The wizard's hand was hidden under his sleeve, holding something. Only the human who claimed to be the envoy had a normal expression on his face under the hood. Nair glanced at them with his pale green eyes. After my father's death, I don't have much to do now. I just want to lead my people through this difficult winter, the young lion man said. He stood up, the brass rings on his mane clinking against each other. The Toquinen people may have lost their beloved king for a while, but that doesn't mean we have fallen. We will not ally ourselves with the humans. This winter is very cold, the human girl standing in the middle said. Half of her pretty face was exposed under her hood, and she smiled faintly. Tomorrow's winter will be even colder. Can I take it that you're provoking us? Nair frowned. But I won't argue with a woman. You can leave. The young girl raised her head, and everyone felt their hearts skip a beat. Her eyes shone like the stars in the night sky, and they seemed to be able to see through people's hearts. I am the daughter of Duke Diomedes. Do you dare to make a bet with me, Your Highness Nair? What bet? Nair clearly did not want to be looked down upon by a woman. I will convince you. The bet is the future of the Toquinen lion men. What if you lose? I will marry you. The young lion man's heart skipped a beat. Lion men's females were slender, and their beauty standards were not that different from humans. But no matter what, he could not deny the beauty of the young girl in front of him. Her eyes were so sharp that they could see through people's hearts. He fell silent at first sight. But he still shook his head. I can't accept this. The young girl did not seem to mind. She glanced at her companion, and the wizard took out an old piece of parchment from under his sleeve. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the wizard carefully unfolded the parchment and placed it in front of the lion men leaders. When they saw the parchment, the expressions of the lion men changed. Nair clenched his fists, and he felt a rush of blood to his head. His eyes blazed with anger as he glared at the young girl. Her face, which he had thought was pure and beautiful, was now twisted and vicious in his eyes. It was only a crumpled piece of parchment, and it did not seem to be complete. The yellowed, charred, and cracked paper was densely filled with words, but in the blank corner, there was a somewhat black claw print. The paw print was torn from the middle, like a mark of humiliation, twisting and turning to separate the history and honor of the lion men. Under the pressure of the darkness dragon, the Temple of the Earth was the first to withdraw from the sacred covenant. The furious Flame King Gretel tore the oath of the Toquinen people in front of the king of the lion men, and threw it in front of his former best friend. The lion men's hero, the Lion King of the Toquinen people, was too ashamed to face his best friend, and did not have the face to take away his half of the covenant. And so, this eternal shame stayed with Cruz for nearly 1,000 years. This was also the hatred that the lion beast men of Toquinen bore for generations. Their former king was forced by the orders of the Temple of Earth. Not long after the greatest hero in the history of the lion beast men withdrew from the covenant, he died of depression. And Nair's family was the inheritor of that great name. Today, 1,000 years later, we all know the truth, the young girl replied quietly. The Lion King used his own way to end his guilt, but we can't change history. For 1,000 years, the Toquinen people have suffered undeserved condemnation. My father only asked me to return it to you. Nair was stunned. The leaders of the lion men were also stunned. That was the long-lost glory of Toquinen, lying there quietly. He instinctively wanted to reach out and grab it, but it was too difficult. 1,000 years of regret, because of failure and the inferiority of the betrayers, the lion men were trapped in this barren grassland. The wish of countless people, night after night, made every Lion Man king want to go back to that moment, even if it meant death, to change Tokwinen's fate. But people could not change history. Confusion, inferiority, and self-doubt. This was the mentality of many Tokwinen people. The tragedy seemed to have been cast from the beginning. A history without heroes was as bleak as an eternal night for a people. Because they were the descendants of the betrayers. But the young Lion Man finally clenched his fists. "What do you want?" he asked calmly. The pride and honor of a people were not earned by charity. If the ancestors had done wrong, the descendants had to make up for it. The young girl looked up at the Lion Man King. He was only a young boy, but he already had the bearing of a king. "This winter is very cold. Many people will die on the grasslands." She looked at the heavy snow outside the tent. "Next winter may be even colder. The food on the grasslands can't feed so many people. We have to abandon the elderly and kill the weak babies. Perhaps only 1 in 10 newborns can grow up in hunger. How many young adults did Tokwinen lose this year? How long will it take for them to recover?" She looked back and smiled warmly. "Your Highness Nair, we only have one request, and that is to escort us out of this grassland." After that, she bowed to the crowd and turned to leave. It was quiet in the tent. There was only the sound of water splashing. "Your Highness." The leaders of the Lion Men whispered. They exchanged glances with each other. Their green eyes were filled with worry, anxiety, and something else. "Wait." Nair finally mustered up the courage to stop her. "Are you going to Anzaroda? Are you allied with the Hazel people?" The young girl stopped and nodded with her back to him. The young Lion Man seemed to have made up his mind. He turned back to his men and said, "Take those things out." There was silence in the tent. The servants brought in a box and carefully placed the contents of the box on the short table, connecting it with the torn parchment. It was the torn Treaty of Alliance that the Lion Beast men had found over the past hundreds of years. These fragments seemed to symbolize the obsession of the Tokwinen people. They carefully collected it as if one day they could recover their long-lost glory from these fragments. But at this moment, all of this seemed to be a little trivial. Soon, a crumpled and broken piece of parchment appeared on the low table. It was about 1/4 to 1/5 of its original size. The broken dark red claw print was scattered on the fragments. Nair glanced at the young girl. He walked forward and used his claws to cut open a wound on his palm. Then, he let his blood drip onto the black and dried claw mark. The rose-red blood dripped down, and in the bright light, the old and new blood seemed to gradually merge at this moment. "Lion Men of Tokwinen, fulfill your promise once more. What we failed to do 1,000 years ago, we will make up for 1,000 times today. We will go with you, to finish this war. Just as described in the Pale poem." "What is that place?" "Ariel." Breton looked at the sparks in the sky. Black smoke rose from the plains. Even though the stars were faintly discernible and the sky was getting dark, they were still clearly visible. Ariel was an important town in Kovardo, second only to the king's city. The sparks of fire there proved that there was still a battle in Kovardo. The White Lion Legion had not completely fallen. The 3 of them stood on the mountain path, their eyes reflecting the sparks as they silently watched the scene. The accompanying night was also silent. Although they were all injured, the scene in front of them had already made them forget their pain. The kingdom was in a sea of fire. This was their shame. Everyone secretly clenched their teeth. "Is that your city?" a somewhat muffled voice asked. It was an old dwarf, arrogantly sitting on the back of a heavily armored mountain goat. He held a warhammer in his hand and squinted his small eyes as he muttered to himself. Breton turned around and looked at him strangely. How many years had it been since he had seen the dwarves on the surface? To the north of the misty mountain range, there was indeed a small path that led underground. This ancient path passed through the mountains, through deep valleys and ancient forests, through rubble and weathered colossi, and finally reached the entrance of an ancient passage. Many years ago, the mountain dwarves had controlled the entrance of the underground passage, guarding the door to the underworld. They built halls deep in the mountains. These halls were intricately connected and formed the dwarven city. When the dwarven kingdom was at its most prosperous, they had even built a huge empire. But with the decline of the Argent clan, the Rune dwarves and the Argent plains disappeared. The dwarves' glory was gone, and the empire fell apart, leaving behind countless ruins in the darkness of the underground. In the War of the Holy Saints, the dwarves of the Chong Mountain tribe betrayed the allied forces of the humans and elves. From then on, they were rarely seen in the surface world. There were a few dwarven adventurers in human society, but they were not actually residents of the dwarven kingdom. They were a minority that grew up in human society. But these dwarves were obviously different. The dwarf sat on the saddle cushion of his mountain goat. The saddle was as tall as a small mountain. Erwin did not have such a saddle. Moreover, the dwarf's clothes were gorgeous. He wore gold and silver, and the necklace in front of his chest was studded with agates, rubies and sapphires. The heavy dwarven armor was like a work of art. Although Breton did not know much about precious metals, he could tell at a glance that the material of this armor was not simple. He turned to look at the countess behind him. Dilferi's face was pale as she hugged a long box. She mouthed to the two of them, "Mithril, this dwarf's background was obviously not simple." Breton nodded silently in response to the dwarf's question. The dwarf stroked the beard in front of his chest. His large brown beard was woven with brass rings, like a few forked flames. The rings were engraved with intersecting patterns. That was the family emblem of the dwarven nobility. Every dwarven clan was different. Their compatriots living on the surface had long forgotten these traditions. His huge nose showed obvious disdain. "It's not that big." Manrique endured and did not retort. On one hand, these dwarves had saved their lives. On the other hand, there were more than 40 well-equipped dwarven heavy cavalry around the old dwarf. In fact, after the upheaval in Yenbao that day, they had chosen to abandon the airship fleet that was stationed in Yenbao, bringing along the sacred swords and leaving the count's domain. This was mainly to avoid the blockade of Yanalasu and Biel by the rebel army. After all, the airship could not return to the south without passing through King's Harbor. The second reason was that the floating fleet was too big of a target and could easily attract the attention of the Sisaldians. But even so, they had continuously hit a wall in Yenbao. Obviously, Baron Dahl did not intend to give up the holy sword Mither so easily. After breaking through the blockade of the rebels, they had no choice but to change their route to the north. Under the advice of a White Lion Knight from Colossus, they went through the Misty Mountains to Corvado. Although the entire northern region of Erewhon was not stable now, as long as they left Corvado, it would be easy to meet up with the White Lion Legion stationed in Balta. Manrique and Breton believed that after the Battle of Ampere Seal, the White Lion Legion that Her Royal Highness had re-established would not betray them again. But this was the beginning of a difficult journey. The number of rebels intercepting them had decreased, but their enemies this time had become more terrifying monsters. First of all, they had seen the crystal monsters in Count Yenbao's territory, and then there was the terrifying existence that the rebels called the No Race. Every time they encountered them, they suffered heavy losses. After entering the Misty Mountains, they had sacrificed dozens of White Lion Knight along the way to reach here. If it were not for the sudden appearance of these strange dwarves, all of them would have died here. Manrique did not forget that those terrifying monsters were under the hammers of these dwarves. One hammer strike, one kill. It was as simple as smashing watermelons. "Why are those crystal clusters chasing you?" the dwarf asked again. Manrique was stunned. Dilferi and Breton looked at each other and asked softly, "Are you talking about those monsters?" "Yes, crystal clusters. The old dwarf looked at the countess and said, "Little girl, you don't understand how terrifying they are. I have seen them crystallized with my own eyes. There was no life there." Dilfari had never thought that those monsters would be so terrifying. She recalled the scene in Count Yenbao's territory, and her fingers turned white. Breton saw that she did not look too good, so he took the initiative to stand up and retold the whole story. "This is Erwin?" the old dwarf suddenly asked. Breton was stunned and nodded. "You are in luck." The old dwarf nodded and looked at Dilfari carefully. He said that you are the daughter of Count Yenbao. You are called Dilfari. Is your ancestor the son of the Flame family knight Sola? You are from the Swordkeeper family, right? He looked at the box that the countess was hugging tightly and said, "This is the sacred sword Mither. Don't worry, we will help you bring it to where it should go." Dilfari was stunned. She opened her eyes wide and looked at the old dwarf. She even forgot to breathe. At the side, there was a commotion. The human knight pulled out their swords and looked at the dwarves vigilantly. Breton and Manrique also stood in front of Dilfari. Breton pulled out his sword, while Manrique took out a gun from his pocket. "What do you want?" the young captain asked nervously. But the old dwarf did not even look at him. He turned his head and ordered a dwarven knight behind him, "Blow the horn." "Do you see that place?" He pointed in the direction of Corvado, where flames were soaring into the sky. "Let's go there. It's called Ariel." "I asked before." The dwarven knight nodded and immediately took the horn from his waist. But before he could lift the horn with both hands, Dilfari's voice finally reached him. Who are you?" The old dwarf put on his helmet and turned around. He answered in a low voice, "You can call me Califen, or the Griffin King." In the name of Aaron's sacred anvil, for the Silver Plains, the dwarven heavy cavalry shouted in unison. Whoa, the horn blew. Chapter 1505. Marshall stared at the forest on the hillside. The forest made the Sapphire Mountains appear dark in winter. A group of patrolling soldiers slowly slid down from the forest on the hillside. Only a few of them had intact armor, but their battle robes were tattered and hung on their bodies like rags. Some of them used sharpened wooden sticks as weapons, and everyone looked hungry. He lowered his head and silently wiped his long sword. The blade was already curled. The reason it was not broken was that every White Lion Knight in Tonajul was equipped with the best equipment, refined armor and swords that could only be produced on a small scale in handmade workshops. Especially the weapons purchased in batches before 776, they were all of the highest standards set by the merchant lady. They were the finest products produced by the master craftsman in Hazel. The ragged cotton armor of the noble soldiers could not even withstand a single strike from the golden-haired knight, and the armor of the Lord's knights could only take a few more hits. Sometimes, even the armor-piercing awl could not be used. He still remembered the look of shock and fear on the golden-haired knight's face during the first battle. But superior equipment could not determine the outcome of a battle with a great disparity in strength. The army of Grimoires had formed layers of blockade in the south. There were thousands of them, and there were also the gargoyles and iron men of the Sausalds. The White Lion Guards and the Valkyries protected the princess. Day after day, they were forced to the Sapphire Mountains. There was no food in the mountains to support an army, especially in winter. Even if there were only a few hundred of them, the rebels wanted to trap them alive. Marshall chewed on a piece of hard grass root, which was the last of his food reserves. As for the specifics, he could not remember when he had last eaten. His brain was a little numb from the cold. The last meal was when he shared a roasted mountain rat with his colleagues, but he had forgotten when it was. But food was getting harder and harder to find. The patrolling soldiers were not so much on guard, but looking for food. A few hundred people crossing the mountain forest was like a disaster. They even had to dig a layer of the frozen soil to look for hibernating animals. If not for the poisonous bark of the sapphire trees, they could also be used to make soup. He remembered the first few bloody battles. Both sides had tried their best to knock each other down, but the nobles had retreated after paying a terrible price. They had chosen to surround the enemy instead of attacking. In the first battle, he remembered that he had killed 3 people and was covered in wounds. Later on, the more he killed, the fewer wounds he had. In the end, there was no one for him to kill. The other party stopped attacking. Sometimes, he thought that it would have been better if he had died in those bloody battles so that he wouldn't have to suffer. He was one of the 3rd batch of White Lion Knights. This was also the last batch of White Lion Knights trained by Tonajul before the war. He was a native of Tonajul, born as a commoner. When he was selected, his results were neither good nor bad. However, 3 days ago, he replaced his captain and became a great knight. In Erewhon, this step meant that one would become a true noble, and one would become a baron. However, this was meaningless because no one knew if they could survive the next battle, just like the person he replaced. Marshall didn't have any regrets. He was not the eldest son. Before the Second Tonajul War, his shoemaker father had kicked him into the army camp and told him to stand up like a real man to protect what was really worth protecting. However, he did not make it in time for the war because the war ended in the first week he entered the army camp. During the Battle of Ampere Seal, he was selected to join the White Lion Guards. In a sense, this was considered a success. However, he only felt a little regretful. The White Lion Guards would not admit defeat so easily. It was like a pride of lions that had lost their Lion King. If the Lion King was still around, they would not have ended up like this. Marshall gently put down the rag. The curved blade of the sword shone brightly in the cold winter air. A handsome face was reflected on the blade that was as bright as a pool of dim light. That face had a very serious expression. The young knight was slightly stunned because that face was not his own. He raised his head in astonishment, and a tall shadow cast over him. With a clang, his sword fell to the ground. Now, the Lion King was back. The eldest princess' face was pale as she leaned against a cushion. Her silver pupils revealed a deep contemplation. She had been injured and was so weak that she was almost boneless. Her originally slender hand was now even more clearly visible. Under her almost transparent skin, the blue veins quietly flowed. There was a sickly beauty to it. There was a small gap in the tent door, and bright light flowed in from the outside and fell on her body. She stubbornly sat up straight, and with both hands grasping her sword, she stared in that direction for a long time. Freya could not help but feel sorry for her. Last night, Brunhilde told her that the princess was in so much pain that she broke out in a cold sweat in her sleep. Her clothes were soaked in sweat, but she did not make a sound when she woke up, as if the wound had completely healed. "Eat something, Your Highness." She could not help but persuade her again. "What about you?" Griffin turned and asked. "I've eaten." Freya quickly replied. The soldiers found some chickadees. She could not continue because the princess was looking at her with a half-smile. She pointed at the food on the plate. "The chickadees have all gone to the south of Chablis in winter. This is chicken, just like what you gave me yesterday. You said you found a turtle dove yesterday and we each ate half of it. Is this the other half that you were supposed to eat?" "Your Highness, Griffin shook her head. "Freya, I can eat the Roman lady's unprofitable business no matter how long it takes." To think that she gave it to the soldiers as rations. "This chicken tastes like dried wood that has been stored for a year. Didn't anyone tell you about it?" She blinked her eyes playfully on her pale face. "As a princess, I'm very picky. Although you're Everton's daughter, you might never understand the life of a noble since you were born as a commoner." The knight's face turned red after being exposed. She wondered if her brain was not working properly. Otherwise, why couldn't she do something as simple as telling a lie? But the smile on Griffin's face disappeared. Even in such a weak state, she still exuded a dignified aura. She frowned and said, "Freya, did you secretly save your rations for me?" "But I'm not like you, Your Highness." Freya quickly defended herself. Griffin raised her head and looked at her. "You're my commander, silly girl." She stretched out her hand and stroked the sword lightly. "We've already found out that Amandina went to the lighthouse after leaving Magedon. If we move closer to Grimoires, we'll have a chance to save her. If I can't recover from my injuries, you'll take my sword and represent my will. You must save her. Your Highness." Griffin raised her hand. "This is also for the war in Tonajol, Freya, and I can't let Mr. Brando down." She gently closed her eyes, her long eyelashes trembling slightly, and her voice lowered. "I don't want to leave any regrets. Do you understand, Freya? I don't want to let everyone down. Just like my father, he owes you Butchie an apology. He is him, and you are you." Freya's chest heaved up and down. "Everyone in Butchie curses your father, saying that he's a fatuous ruler, but he has a good daughter. For you, we're even willing to forgive your father's mistakes. Because we only hope that Your Highness can live well, and one day, under her watch, everything in this kingdom will become better than before." Griffin's eyes were a little red, and she smiled. "Don't worry, I won't give up so easily. Even in the darkest moment, I've never been defeated. I'm Halifa's daughter, and the blood of the Holy King flows in my body. No one can defeat me, not even death." Her words suddenly stopped. Her silver eyes were a little frozen. Freya was just about to say something, but a slender hand was already placed on her shoulder. Freya almost froze. She clearly felt someone enter the tent, but she thought it was Brunhilde, because the Valkyries didn't report. But as soon as she felt the familiar warmth of the hand on her shoulder, she immediately understood that, who's back? The strong female knight's eyes were immediately covered with a layer of water. Her eyes were as red as a rabbit's, and when she turned her head, tears burst out of her eyes. She wanted to tell the person in front of her how difficult their situation was. She wanted to tell this person how worried she was about the war in Tonajol. She wanted to tell him that Amandina had been taken away by those people, and she didn't know if she was alive or dead. She wanted to cry out loud, just like a child. But duty made her stand in place, and she still let the tears flow down her face. She looked at the familiar face in front of her with teary eyes. Brando looked at the crying Valkyrie with some heartache. He never thought that the flag of Aween in his memory would one day be helpless in front of him, like a child without feet. Strong and firm, weak and slender, the moment when the two different kinds of beauty intersected, it deeply touched the softest part of his heart. But the princess was still at the side, and Brando could only gently wipe away the tears on the Valkyrie's face. "I'm sorry, ladies, I'm late. But in my opinion, it's always just right," the princess replied with a faint smile. In the narrow tent, the two of them looked at each other in silence. One of them stood. One of them sat on the bed. Freya suddenly understood that he and the princess might have a lot to talk about. Her tears were still wet, and she hugged Brando tightly, secretly holding his hand. Brando understood what she meant, and he sighed in his heart at this kind girl. He smiled at her and nodded. I'm going to see Miss Brunhilde. She might have something to ask me." Miss Knight found a poor excuse and turned to leave. When the two of them passed by each other, Brando whispered in her ear, "There's food outside, I brought some supplies for you." Freya's face turned red, and she ran away without looking back. Princess Griffin watched the interaction between the two of them with an astute attitude. Her eyes were bright, and she smiled slightly, but she was actually a little concerned. "No one can defeat you, not even death, Your Highness," Brando looked at his princess, "because they can't reach you at all. Your knight is in front of you, and no one can do it without my permission. No one can do it with your permission, Princess Griffin added. Mr. Knight, you seem to have experienced a lot. Yes, is there a hint of vicissitudes? No. After saying this, even though she was very weak, she couldn't help but laugh. Brando also felt the change in the princess. She had become more mature. Perhaps this was the real her, and gradually overlapped with the shadow in his memory. He took out the angel's heart bottle and motioned for her to drink, but the elven girl was unmoved and only looked at him with expectant eyes. Brando was stunned, and then his heart jumped slightly. He helped the weak girl up, and the two of them snuggled in an ambiguous way. The fairy princess looked at him with trust. Brando's heart beat a little faster as he lowered the angel's heart bottle and dripped a drop of the glowing liquid on the tip of her slender tongue. The princess swallowed it, and the majestic vitality contained in the liquid immediately began to work. Her withered limbs became plump again, and her skin became white and delicate. Her silver eyes became brighter little by little, and her cheeks became healthy and rosy. Her scattered silver hair glowed with a dazzling brilliance. It was like a withered flower once again began to bloom in life. Griffin looked at this incredible scene in shock. She didn't even care when the serious injuries on her body were completely healed. This is the angel's heart bottle. That is the holy artifact formed by the blood of angels. Brando nodded. The princess seemed to be lost in thought. I owe you even more, my Mr. Knight. I'm just worried that the princess still hates me, Brando replied helplessly. Let's call it even. Princess Griffin raised her head in embarrassment. Don't talk about that. But the memory that made her embarrassed and angry was now a little sweet. This topic made the half-elf girl feel a little embarrassed, and she slightly moved away from his arms. Although Brando was a little disappointed, he also understood that the princess' actions today had already proved her trust in him. He couldn't go too far, and the distance between the two of them just now had already made him a little embarrassed. Princess Griffin calmed down first, and began to describe what happened after he left. Some of these things were already heard by Brando, but when it came from the princess' mouth, it was a different feeling. When Brando heard the part about Erwin's country, the ambiguous atmosphere in the tent had already faded to almost nothing. After a long narration, Princess Griffin suddenly stopped, and then asked, "Can you tell me about the Cisaldians?" This topic seemed to have opened a Pandora's box, and the tent suddenly fell silent. Brando looked at her in surprise. He originally thought that the princess wouldn't take the initiative to mention it. After thinking for a while, he didn't have much preparation in his heart, so he simply told her everything that happened after he left Erwin, and finally mentioned the Cisaldians. He did this to avoid embarrassment for the princess. The elven girl obviously understood this, and she felt a little warm in her heart. About Brando's trip, she actually knew a little from other sources, but after all, it wasn't so detailed, and there were several times when she was entranced. She was a good listener, and her good upbringing prevented her from showing subconscious tiredness at any time. Moreover, Brando's narration was fascinating, and there were a few times when the princess exclaimed softly. But when he reached the last part, Princess Griffin's expression turned cold. She didn't expect that so many major events had already happened in this world, and yet the nobles of Erwin were still arguing endlessly over trivial matters. They didn't even hesitate to disturb the kingdom, colluding with outsiders and evil cultists. What a laughable joke. Perhaps in the eyes of outsiders, this ancient kingdom was simply an abandoned child that couldn't be saved. When Brando finished his last sentence, the tent fell silent again. Both of them lowered their heads, as if they were thinking about something, and the air was filled with an aura of silence. After a long time, Princess Griffin said faintly, "So at least many people in the royal faction knew from the beginning that the Twilight Dragon was behind the Cisaldians?" Brando nodded silently. Princess Griffin was expressionless. She seemed to be weighing something in her heart, but when she finally opened her mouth, it took her a lot of effort to say, "The ancient nobles and their noble beliefs created this kingdom. Erewhon has never forgotten those who fought to change its fate, but history is always changing, and some people are indeed no longer so suitable. Brando looked at her hands that were clenched into fists. Her knuckles were obviously white, and they were even trembling slightly. She was born in the flourishing era and had witnessed the best spirit of this kingdom. But she had also witnessed her father die under cold-blooded politics. She hated this outdated system more than anyone else, but she also had a rare warmth in her heart. However, at this very moment, with just one sentence, she had ended the lives of countless people, including those who had worked with her before, those who had supported her, her friends, and even her maternal grandfather, the relative who had reached out to her when she was in a desperate situation. But if the history of a kingdom could not move forward in a pool of blood, then it could only turn to dust in the flames. Brendel wanted to comfort the weak girl, but he said, "Don't worry. It's not enough." Princess Griffin raised her head and stared at him coldly with her silver eyes. "This time, Your Highness, don't forget that I'm also on the opposite side of you." The princess took a deep breath, as if she had already made a great decision. "I'll marry you, and we have a marriage contract." "In the future, you can," Brando smiled bitterly. Although it was also a political marriage, he felt a little warm in his heart. At least he understood that in her heart, his position could even be on par with her ideals and beliefs. He looked at the princess, but he did not want to see her softening at this time. He did not know whether he should be happy or angry, but he still shook his head because that was not what he wanted. "Heroes is the king of this kingdom, Your Highness. If we want to give Erewhon the brightest future, we must give him the most legitimate status." The tent fell into a dead silence. After a long time, Princess Griffin raised her head and looked at him with some resentment. "Very well, as you wish, I will execute you, the Count of Randner and Tonagel, the Lord of Abes, and the great hero of Erewhon in public, for blasphemy against the members of the royal family and disregard for the central government." Brando scratched his head embarrassedly. Stop, I'm not that great, Your Highness. In fact, there is a relatively gentler way. Maybe I will leave Erewhon. Next, Erewhon will also participate in the war with the Twilight Dragon. I believe that Tonagel and Valhalla will be the backbone of this war. I entrust it to you, and I hope you can use it well. Why should Erewhon listen to your command? Do you mean that Heroes and I are just puppets under your control? Princess Griffin's face was expressionless, and she changed her tone into a cold one. "Unfortunately, after you left, Aween turned to the embrace of the Twilight Dragon. Anyway, its selfish princess and king only care about their own people. As for the great responsibility of saving the world, I'm afraid the people of Aween are unable to shoulder it." Brando knew that he had offended the princess and did not know whether to laugh or cry for a while. But after a while, he heard Princess Griffin ask faintly, "Where are you going?" "Maybe I have to settle the score with the Bugas first, then Saint Tassel." He wanted to continue, but Princess Griffin interrupted him. "At least before you leave, Mr. Knight, can you hug me again?" Brando was stunned. He looked up, and Princess Griffin's slender neck was slowly dyed red, and her blush was extremely cute. She tilted her head slightly and did not look at him. Brando opened his mouth, and he wanted to say no, but found that his body was not under his control at all. He felt his heart beating very fast, and he slowly and gently knelt in front of the princess. He did not even dare to look into her eyes. He just gently took Griffin into his arms and felt that the half-elf girl's weight was as light as a feather. Princess Griffin curled up motionlessly in his arms, tenderly listening to her knight's strong and powerful heartbeat. She whispered, "I'm sorry if I accidentally diluted the position of the Roman lady in your heart, but I was also your fiancé, wasn't I?" What else could make one's heart soften more than a strong and proud princess lowering herself to whisper sweet nothings into one's ear? But just as she said, other than blaming himself, what else could he say? "I'm sorry, I can't say those 3 words easily, because I have a responsibility to this kingdom, because I've already promised the kingdom. It's difficult to promise the king." Brendel listened quietly to the princess's story. "I have one last request," Princess Griffin said in a soft voice, "Mr. Knight." She looked up at him. "Please be sure to bring back Miss Amandina." Brando nodded seriously. Because this was not a promise, but an agreement between two ladies. Chapter 1506. Cheers could be heard from afar from time to time. 3 seven-headed lizards were attacking the rebel army's camp at the foot of the mountain. These gigantic creatures had their chests above the canopy of the trees. When they picked up the rebel soldiers and threw them into the air, their heads were as tall as spruce. The seven-headed lizards were covered in armor, even their heads were covered in spiked helmets. Below them were layers of chain armor that protected their long necks. The soft arrows and spears of the rebel soldiers had no effect on them at all. They charged forward and broke through the camp. The wooden walls creaked under the impact and cracked inch by inch. A row of iron men in the camp came forward and were flattened by a single stomp. Facing such a monster, the psychological defense of the rebels finally collapsed. After a scream, they turned around and fled. The Knight of the White Lion Guard saw the great 4 creatures made by the craftsman being slapped like paper. They could not help but click their tongues. Although they knew about the existence of these snake lizard beasts in Valhalla, they did not expect them to be so powerful. Could it be that Miss Monica was very careful with these treasures? Dozens of gargoyles rose into the air, and under the command of a wind elemental djinn, they flew toward the snake lizard beasts. However, the snake lizard beasts moved their torsos under the command of the beast tamer, revealing a 2-story tower on their backs. On the tower, the tree elf archers were holding silver longbows, and rows of figures stood elegantly behind the parapet. They drew their bows, and the creaking sound of the bows rang through the forest. "Draw your bows. Release." A rain of black arrows flew out, like a wall rising in the air, and swept across like a hurricane. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the gargoyles withered, leaving only the djinn roaring violently in the air. Thunder and lightning roared in its cloud-like body. However, the commander on the tower had already noticed this lone commander, and a black flag was raised. The elves changed their target and began to shoot at the rebels who were fleeing below, because physical attacks did almost no damage to the incorporeal elemental creatures. The ones who attacked were the druids. Beams of flame arrows flew out from the tower and hit the wind elemental, causing it to howl in pain. The djinn of wind elemental had once formed an alliance with the Bugis, so the grey wizards of the Sassalds naturally could not ignore their allies being attacked. They rose from the forest one after another, trying to stop these giant beasts. However, before they could attack, rows of silver figures descended from the clouds. They were the Valkyrie. They rode on the raging flame heavenly horse and held silver spears and scimitars in their hands as they charged towards the battlefield. The Valkyrie from Tonagel had arrived and joined the Valkyrie led by Brunhilde. The number of Valkyries had increased significantly, almost forming a sizable force. Ever since the restoration of the Cloud Gate, Valhalla had begun to summon Valkyrie on a small scale. Seeing these Valkyries, the young Knight of the White Lion Guards could not help but cheer again. Although they were now dressed in rags and looked like a group of beggars with their arms around each other's shoulders, this did not hinder the enthusiasm and excitement in their hearts. These Valkyries had been their greatest support these days. If not for them holding back the Sassalds' grey wizards, they would have been burned to ashes by magic. The grey wizards and the Valkyries were old rivals, and the fighting strength of the two sides was about the same. It was obvious that it would be difficult to determine the winner in a short time. However, after the rebels lost their greatest support on the battlefield, defeat was only a matter of time. Of course, to the people of Tonagel, this was no longer important. Compared to the battle in Menta, this was just a small matter. The results of a few thousand noble rebels were not even worth mentioning. After Brando left Princess Griffin's tent, he went to find Freya. The Valkyrie of Erewhon was sitting alone on a rock in a daze, not paying attention to the battle below. When Brando found her, she was startled and hurriedly wiped away her tears, jumping down from the rock with a red face. You didn't see anything, did you? Freya asked with a red face. Didn't I see it in the tent already? This answer was naturally met with a fierce glare. Freya hesitated for a moment. Thinking of Amandina, she felt a little guilty. Brando, I didn't protect Miss Amandina well. I'm sorry, Brando shook his head, your opponent is the Sausalds. We've already done well this time. If you really want to apologize, go and say it to Amandina in person. What? Brando looked at the battle in the distance. He withdrew his gaze and said, let's go, we'll go and rescue Amandina now. Freya's eyes widened in disbelief. She pointed at her chest, I'm going too. What, you don't want to go? Brando smiled, you lost her, so naturally you'll be the one to find her. I'll take you along. Freya felt her heart fill with warmth, but she could not say anything. She could only look at him gently, using her eyes to express her thoughts. It was gratitude and gratitude. Of course, it was not just this time. I'm sorry, Brando. She suddenly said with an apologetic tone. Brando was stunned. What, didn't I say you don't need to be sorry? It's not that, Freya blushed a little, it's because of some things in the past. What things? Freya just shook her head and pretended to be mute. That seemed like a long time ago. There were only memories left in her heart. I want to find my parents. My uncle and aunt said that when I grow up, they will tell me who they are. They said that my father is a knight, a great person like Sir Everton. One day, I will also become a knight. The Roman people naturally want to become merchants, because merchants can earn a lot of money, so much that my aunt and I will never be able to spend it all. What about you, Brando? Me? I don't know, but I don't want to learn any swordsmanship. I want my grandfather to understand that the truly powerful things in this world are not swords. One day, if I have the ability to do so, I will make sure that Alwyn will never be disturbed by the flames of war, so that its people can live a peaceful life without swords, and not live in fear every day like they are now. How is that possible? The undead are so terrifying, how can they let us go? Brando, how do you plan to deal with the undead? I haven't thought about it yet, but I have a feeling that I have seen that world in my dreams. If it exists, I will definitely find it. She stood in front of the young boy and girl and asked them, Brando, Mr. Martin is the chief swordsman instructor of Fortress Redon, and he is a truly capable person. I am going to join the militia, and Breton will be going as well. Don't you want to protect the others? Come with us. The young boy shook his head. I might have to go back to Bragg's for a while. Let's talk about it when we have the chance. My father wants me to inherit his mill, and he said in the letter that my grandfather's health is getting worse, and he might want to see me. She was a little disappointed, but there were some things that she did not ask. What about you, Roman? I will wait for Brando to come back. If he is going to join the militia, I will go as well. The young girl nodded and turned to leave. 7 years had passed since then. When they met again, it was already the summer of the year of blooming flowers. And that summer night, the stars in the sky were especially bright. The two of them walked side by side in the camp. Freya secretly looked at Brando, who was beside her. So he never forgot what she said at that time. She always knew that she was Roman, and she was the stupidest person. But why did he choose this path? Mr. Martin said that his path was different from ours. So Mr. Martin had already noticed something. Did he know that Brando was the descendant of the sword Saint Darius from the beginning? Freya thought silently. Have you already activated your elemental activation? Freya, can you fly? Freya came back to her senses and looked at Brando's hand that was stretched out to her. Yes, she nodded, Andrea and the others taught me. Then take my hand. She reached out her hand, hesitated for a moment, and then put it in the warm palm of her hand. At this moment, his restless heart surprisingly calmed down. Rows of seats, religious-style reliefs, 12 layers of columns going up one by one, supporting layers of arches immersed in the darkness. 170 stone statues watched the noisy hall from the shadows. At the top of the vault, the final battle between the Azure Knight and the Twilight Dragon was painted. The heroes of the gods and the destruction of the world were painted in green and red paint, each occupying half of the mural, and the skylight was projected from the central hole. A beam of white light passed through the darkness, and the long circular table in the center of the hall was suddenly carved out of the darkness. The people of Fanzin, Cruz, the Wind Elves, the representatives of the Silver Bay States, the Bugas, and the Druids each occupied an area, followed by the representatives of the White City States and the Barbarians. In the center of the long circular table was the master of the place, the elemental tyrant of the Myrna people in a red robe. Tumen, Mephistopheles, and Endrique were divided on the left and right of the old man. Next to the three of them was Grey Sword Mephisto, who was looking at the area where the representatives of Cruz were. It was more than half empty at the moment, and only a few people from the military were sitting there, including Mangrove, Duke Ludwig, and Veronica. The elves had not arrived yet, and there were only a few guards in the Saint Ossoul seat. The elven girls were whispering to each other with longbows on their backs. The Silver Alliance's area was almost empty, and there were only a few people left. Most of the wizards had left Babel Fortress, and only a few apprentices were left, and they did not speak to any suggestions. A taciturn elder sat in the druid seat, proving the existence of the Ring of Skies. Although the area of the Silver Bay States was bustling with people, there were not many who had the right to speak. A considerable number of these people were asking about the wilderness of 4 territories, and why the Silver Bay Coalition army had not yet arrived in Alcash. As for the barbarians, most of them were the mountain people who had fled the Latch of Wa and the Highlanders of Anzaruda. They rarely sent a representative, but they rarely expressed their opinions. Finally, there were the representatives of Fanzin and the White City States. The former mainly consisted of the members of the Fanzin Royal Knights and the Air Knight Regiment, who had been ordered by the Pope to come as reinforcements. The latter were basically just there to make up the numbers, except for the faraway Eagle Adventurers Guild who had sent over 300 mercenaries to help. After all, the Fanzin and the Wild Elves of Atlanta still had to deal with the threat of the Great Glacier Race and the Horned Beetles from the east. The decision on whether to evacuate Babel Fortress was in fact mainly based on the opinions of the Wind Elves and Cruz people. However, the sudden absence of the Cruz people and the Wind Elves before the meeting made most people feel puzzled. For a while, there was a lot of discussion in the hall, and the buzzing sound of discussion echoed. Almost all of the main representatives of Saint Ossoul were not present, and the elven guards who were responsible for maintaining order naturally did not participate in this high-level meeting. On the other hand, there was a serious dispute within the military on the Cruz side. Veronica was adamant that they should not evacuate the fortress. Her insistence was not without reason. After leaving the Alcash area, the Crystal Legion army could attack the entire wilderness of 4 territories from the Alcash Mountains. After that, there were thousands of miles of plains, and there was no way to defend. After that, they would have to retreat to the ancient Twilight Forest and rely on the White Mountain and the Autumn Twilight Mountains for defense. Although the ancient forest was the natural border of Saint Ossoul, it was hard to say how useful it would be for the Crystal Legion army. More importantly, the conditions there were not necessarily better than here. If the immortal fortress of Babel could not be defended, then what was the point of building a defense line in other places? They could retreat today, but what about after that? Would they have to flee into the wilderness like in the War of the Holy Saints? This time, the enemy was not only from the west. Her idea was supported by most of the young officers, but they faced difficulties from reality. The attack of the Twilight Army had broken through the last line of defense, and the scattered citadels and defense facilities outside the Tower of Babel would be completely destroyed in the next few days. Without logistical support, how long could they hold on in this lonely fortress? 1 month, 2 months, half a year, or a year. So on the other hand, to be exact, Duke Ludwig completely disagreed with such a desperate approach. Trapped in the fortress, waiting for the Bugis to solve their internal problems, and then let the Wind Elves change their mind and return to the negotiating table with Madara's undead. How could military operations be so passive and hope for the best possible outcome? But what if it was too late? The world of order could not afford such a loss if the allied forces of the humans and the elves were buried here. His statement was also supported by some people, or even most people. After all, most people still understood the principle of, if you lose the land, you can save the people and the land. If you lose the people, you can save the land, you can lose the people and the land. And it sounded more logical. Logically speaking, Veronica's heart actually did not disagree with this logic. But the female Legion commander had a deeper hidden concern in her heart. If the Allied forces retreated to the White Mountain and the Autumn Twilight Mountains, then the Empire's passage to Erewhon would be completely exposed. At the mention of the border country in the southeast of the Empire, Veronica felt a little strange in her heart. This was not because she was emotional, but because she had a faint feeling that this matter was not so simple. Although Erewhon was just an inconspicuous existence to most of the Empire's people, it was precisely this small kingdom that had shown amazing strength in the recent civil strife of the Empire. Veronica felt that the young man could not see through him. She always felt that he might have some secrets, otherwise it would be difficult to explain the rapid rise of this small kingdom. What was even more difficult to explain was that if the disaster of the White Mountain could be understood, then why did the Bugis rebel run to Erewhon to stir up trouble? That place had nothing to do with this war at all. What if the purpose of the Twilight Dragon was to destroy this small kingdom from the beginning? The more Veronica thought about it, the more she felt that she might have seen through the Twilight Dragon's movements, but this judgment was completely contrary to her common sense and logic. It did not make sense that the Twilight Dragon's army would not deal with the two powerful civilizations of Cruz and Saint Tassel, but first destroy a small border country. She could only speculate that the Twilight Dragon had other intentions. But this was what she found hard to say. A military operation of such a large scale, the meaning behind it could affect the future of the entire continent. No one would judge based on their own conjecture, no matter how confident they were in that conjecture. And she could not prove her conjecture. Because of the disaster of Anzaruda, the land contact between Cruz and Erewhon had long been cut off. Now almost all the news about the kingdom came from the Silver Bay area, but the Silver Bay area actually only received the magic transmission from the south. Now, no one could go to Erewhon to confirm the accuracy of the news. After the outbreak of the war, the commercial exchanges in various areas had long been stagnant. Veronica could only choose to stick to her own opinion. But her attitude had tended to be stubborn in the eyes of outsiders, and even those who supported her at the beginning could not help but waver after a period of time. There were also some pro-war parties, most of which were the young people of various noble families. They seemed to have been organized by someone to persuade the hesitant two-faced parties. At first, Duke Ludwig thought that these people were recruited by Veronica, but later he found that the female army commanders seemed to be disdainful of such a thing. However, the political influence of these young people was weak, and neither side took them seriously. Duke Ludwig could only shake his head in response to Veronica's stubbornness. No, no. He kept objecting. The argument between the two became louder and louder, and it even covered the discussion in the hall. People turned their heads to look in this direction. Mangrove's expression was a little awkward, but at this time, a servant hurried in from outside the hall. Mangrove had a bad feeling from the uneasy look on the servant's face. The servant came to his side and leaned over to whisper a few words in his ear. When Mangrove heard this, he suddenly stood up from his seat. "What did you say?" Chapter 1507. We've just received news that the Silver Bay Coalition army was attacked near Canebell. We've lost contact with them for 2 days. Mangrove stood up and looked at the crowd. His expression gradually calmed down as he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was extremely penetrating. It echoed in the hall for a long time. 1 person, 2 people, and even more people stopped talking. Some people did not react for a while, and some were still looking for the source of the voice. However, the hall gradually quieted down. This silence seemed to be contagious. In the end, even Veronica and Duke Ludwig stopped arguing and looked over. The hall was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. After a while, someone stood up. It was a representative from Silver Bay, probably from Desandro or the Duchy of Sword Poplar. He looked very anxious. "Is the news accurate, my lord?" Mangrove could understand the man's anxiety, but he only nodded slightly in greeting. "It's news from Silver Bay." As soon as this was said, the crowd was in an uproar. "Martha above, how did the coalition army get attacked? Who attacked them? If these monsters appear near Canebell, our escape route is in danger. Are you kidding me? They're right here, right in front of us." Veronica's beautiful eyebrows were already furrowed. She was very dissatisfied with these incompetent people. She pressed on the table and stood up. Her emerald green eyes were solemn. As soon as she spoke, her majestic voice was like a sharp sword, splitting the noise in the hall into 2. "Enough, stop quarreling." The hall quieted down again. The female army looked straight into everyone's eyes and confirmed, "This is another Dusk army. It seems that they attacked Anzaruta from the south along the Evergreen Corridor. After the invasion of the Georgandy Ridge, we lost control of this area. They entered the wilderness of the 4 realms from here, and from here to here, they attacked Canebell." She pressed on the projection crystal in front of her, and a map of the wilderness of the 4 realms appeared in the center of the hall. A bright line appeared in the middle of the map under her guidance. In the eyes of the crowd, that line could be described as a cold dagger piercing into the back of Babel Fortress. It turned out that they were not facing 1 legion, but 2. This news was like a blow to the head, hitting many people until they couldn't regain their senses for a long time. Some people's faces began to turn pale, and they slumped back to their seats. Those were the envoys of the small countries. However, there were also some people who still harbored some wishful thinking. They stood up and looked at the map and retorted, "Madam Veronica, where are the Highlanders of Anzaruta? There's no way we didn't receive any news beforehand. We got wind of it, but we didn't pay much attention to it." Veronica drew a circle around Anzaruta and pointed at the place. "We've all seen what the Twilight Legion is like. It's unlikely that the Highlanders who encounter the Crystal Sea will be able to escape, but not all the clans live in this area. The clans living in the peripheral areas may have heard the news, or noticed that some of the clans with whom they have trade relations are silently disappearing, so they began to flee. In fact, they don't need to know what's threatening Anzaruta, but these traditional tribesmen are generally very sensitive. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived so many demonic waves. The migration of the clans in the inner circle squeezed the living space of the weaker clans living in the periphery of Anzaruta, causing a chain reaction that evolved into a great migration that swept across the entire Anzaruta." "Sir, do you mean that the great migration of the Highlanders of Anzaruta may be caused by the Twilight Legion?" "In fact, what the scouts we sent saw was just the surface of this great migration. They couldn't have gone deep into Anzaruta, and those clans in the periphery couldn't have told them what happened in Anzaruta." Veronica looked around at the crowd, her body as straight as a sword, and her voice was rhythmic. She advocated to hold on to Babel Fortress, and this sudden news was extremely unfavorable to her, but the female Legion commander did not have the slightest personal factor in her analysis. We may have made a misjudgment and attributed the reason for this great migration to the disaster caused by the fall of the Black Moon. I think another reason is that the Crystal Cluster deliberately let some of the Highland clans go because they besieged a cruise legion there and did not have the ability to destroy all the Highlanders. You mean the Red Legion may be in Anzarote? Mangrove suddenly raised his head. I can't guarantee it, old vulture, but it's not normal that they have lost contact with us for so long. But if we link the two together, the possibility is the greatest. Veronica looked at her old partner and explained her thoughts. The resonance tower of the crystal cluster has the effect of blocking magic communication. It's not difficult to explain why there is no news of the Red Legion. In other words, this is a speculation. Mangrove raised his thick eyebrows. The situation could be said to be bad, but as a general who had experienced hundreds of battles, his face was very calm. The general fumbled for a while and took out a pipe from his pocket, then realized that there was no fire. He shook his head and helplessly put it on the table. But it's also the most likely speculation. As a soldier, we can't guarantee anything, but at least we have to have the ability to make decisions, right? Veronica looked at the hesitant envoys and shook her head disdainfully. Their appearance in Cane Bell has sent another signal, and that is, we may not be able to count on the Red Legion. They may have already freed up their hands. The Silver Bay Coalition army was a surprise to them, but soon it will be our turn. Everyone looked at her slender fingers and saw another line drawn in the wilderness of 4 territories, straight to the back of the Alcash area. Even the sound of breathing had quieted down. There was a deathly silence in the dark environment. No one would ask if the crystal clusters would have such a strategic vision, because they had clearly revealed their fangs. Even if they were just a bunch of purple beasts without any thoughts, their master had already proven the brilliance of their tactics. A cold and cunning commander, a tireless and fearless army. For some reason, at this moment, the first thing that came to everyone's mind was the undead of Madara. Perhaps they were the only ones who could fight against these monsters? Everyone could not help but have this thought in their minds. Let's vote. Mangrove straightened his coat and stood up from his seat. He raised his thick eyebrows and looked at everyone present. Time is even more pressing. Instead of arguing endlessly, why don't we vote directly? Whether we stay or leave, there is no need to waste any more time. This voice, which was not loud, reverberated above the empty vault. Everyone could not help but hold their breath. Stay or leave. It seemed that there was only one choice. But at this moment, the hall fell into a strange silence. Even the most radical person from before did not take the initiative to speak. Duke Ludwig stood silently in the same place, frowning as he pondered his decision. The situation that everyone was facing was so hopeless. The power that wanted to destroy the world was strong enough to make everyone's hearts waver, and they began to doubt the decision that they originally thought was right. Veronica looked at these people and sighed. These people were already beginning to feel afraid. How could they stay? She could not help but look at Tumen, who was sitting opposite her. This legendary figure rarely expressed his opinion during the entire process of the meeting. This old man was like a silent observer, and he did not say a word about whether people were right or wrong. She saw the old man raise his head and nod at her with a slight smile. When people began to raise their hands to vote, Duke Mihotefen took a last glance at the hall below, then walked back from the balcony and returned to the room. There were only a few people in the room. His daughter was among them, and beside her was his eldest son and the Prime Minister, Nydeven. Then there was the head of the Corney family, who was related to the royal family. The vice-captain of the Knight Regiment stood at the side with a sour expression. On the other side, the old Prime Minister, Nydeven, was sitting on a chair, his eyelids drooping as if he had fallen asleep. Charcoal was burning in the hearth of the fireplace, and the bright flames dyed the narrow room dark red. Everyone's shadows were elongated, making threatening gestures on the mottled walls, like demons and ghosts. The Duke looked at his daughter and ordered, "Vahina, hand over the ring. Do you know what you are doing?" Everyone looked at her. The oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to be on her alone. Vahina bit her lips, and her heart was filled with fear, but she still shook her head. "Are you crazy?" Count Mihodafen glared at his sister. "I don't know what's wrong with you, but that's a token of the royal family. You should return it to the Prime Minister before the great cathedral and His Highness the Crown Prince arrive." But when he remembered that she was his sister, his heart softened. "For the sake of my father and me, Lord Nydivan will not hold it against you." "Brother," Vahina replied firmly, "if it's the Prime Minister, he will definitely understand why I'm doing this. Is it really my fault? The ring is not missing, but why hasn't His Highness the Crown Prince ascended the throne?" "Humph," Duke Mihodafen snorted heavily. He looked at his son with disappointment. Compared to him, this brat did not have the decisiveness of a noble. But when he looked at Vahina, his head hurt even more. This daughter of his had some of the courage he had when he was young, but she was much more daring than him. More importantly, she was brainless. He knew who was adding fuel to the fire behind the scenes. That woman was simply a disaster. Thinking of this, he could not help but look at the old Prime Minister who had been silent all this time. Not a single person in this family was easy to deal with. He had experienced the iron rule of the Silver Queen's father, the previous Kurlutz the Great, and his granddaughter's methods were exactly the same as his at that time. Duke Mihodafen complained that his daughter was not as smart, but when he thought of the fact that the Prime Minister was facing the same predicament as him and had a son who was not so outstanding, his heart calmed down a lot. At this time, the head of the Corney family could not help but speak up. "Miss Vahina, no matter what you think, you should at least hand over the ring. You should at least admit that it doesn't belong to you, right?" "That's not a guess." Vahina wasn't that polite to outsiders and snorted coldly. "That ring doesn't belong to me, but it's hard to say if it belongs to the Kurlutz royal family now." "Shut up. Vahina, are you crazy?" The Duke of Mihodafen and the young Count of Mihodafen shouted at the same time. Especially the latter, who was sweating profusely as he looked at the old Prime Minister, Nydivan. But what made him feel strange was that the head of the Corney family did not refute him immediately, and the old Prime Minister only frowned slightly. Then, the old man finally opened his eyes. His turbid eyes seemed to contain two sharp swords, so sharp that no one dared to look directly at them. "All right, there's no need to say anything more," he spoke slowly, his voice old but powerful as if it was filled with magic, causing the room to quiet down. "Vahina is not wrong, this mistake is not her fault. The great saint and I only had our own considerations, but we did not expect things to turn out this way." The old man looked at Vahina, as if he was sizing her up. In front of him, the daughter of the Lord of Flowers and Leaves was only a child. In his era, even her father was only a junior, and even the old duke had to be respectful in front of him. But he was the eagle of the empire. Tens of millions of Cruz citizens had received protection under his wings, and he did not need to threaten a little girl to maintain his prestige. Moreover, to him, power and status were only decorations. His wisdom was passed down by word of mouth, and his power and authority were deeply ingrained in the hearts of every citizen of the empire. Rather than saying that he was the Prime Minister of the empire, it was more accurate to say that he established the prestige of the Prime Minister of the empire. "Vahina," old Nydivan asked, "do you want to use this ring to change the noble's decision?" Vahina did not expect the old man to ask her personally. She opened her mouth, but her heart was still a little uneasy. The old man was Delphine's grandfather. She and Delphine were best friends, but she had only seen this legendary figure a few times in the banquets of the White Rose Garden. Every time she saw the arrogant and domineering nobles behave like obedient students in front of the former Prime Minister of the Empire, she was secretly shocked. Sometimes, people's understanding of authority was imperceptibly ingrained in their hearts. even Vahina was not an exception. She suddenly thought that perhaps Delphine's ambition for power came from her worship of this old man. Vahina nodded hesitantly in response to the old man's question. When faced with the unknown, people would always feel uneasy. Especially when they knew that the unknown had destructive power. The old man nodded and continued to ask, "Can you tell me why you want them to stay here?" "This is not my decision, but Mr. Brando's." Count Tonajol, Count Mihodafen and the patriarch of the Corny family were stunned. Vahina was ready to throw caution to the wind. She knew that stealing the holy ring of fire was a disgraceful act, so she had to stand her ground. If she could not convince the others, not only her, but her entire family would be implicated. But for some reason, Vahina did not feel too much regret. After everything was said, she only felt a sense of relief. There were some things that had to be done. Because if she did not do it, she would miss the chance to change everything. Vahina gathered her courage and raised her voice. "I think we all know this. When we faced the Silver Queen, it was not us, but Mr. Brando who defeated her and saved the Empire." "Wait, Miss Vahina," the patriarch of the Corny family said, "the people of Cruz are not ungrateful people, but this does not mean that we have to listen to an outsider. This is not our personal matter, it is related to the future of the Empire and even the world." Vahina glanced at him. There was a hint of disdain in her blue eyes. "We know what is right. The Babel Tower is just a symbol, it is not powerful enough to turn the tide of the war. But in fact, everyone in Cruz knows why it is here, and what it symbolizes." The vice-captain of the Flame Knight Regiment heard this and opened his mouth to say something, but in the end, he did not say anything and only let out a long sigh. Vahina continued, "The Babel Tower is really protecting the Saint Tossol behind it, the land of the elves. But its meaning is not only that, because the land behind us is the last line of the wound world of order, our last hope. But in front of this hope, the people of Cruz hesitated. We only remember the enmity and hatred of each other for 1,000 years, but we have forgotten that humans and elves were originally close comrades. If we choose to retreat today, perhaps the people of Cruz will survive, but at the same time, we have given up our last hope. One day, we will regret this. We can retreat today, but what about tomorrow? Our future, where is it, living in fear all day long? But even if we stay, what can we get?" Count Mihodafen could not help but ask his sister, "Besides sacrificing in vain, what else can we get?" "Perhaps it is an opportunity." Opportunity. Count Mihodafen was shocked, only to find that the one who answered his question was the old man who represented the supreme power of the Empire. A promise from 1,000 years ago in exchange for an opportunity to put aside the enmity between the two ancient kingdoms. Do we believe in the Wind Elves? Do we believe that even if the people of Cruz die, the elves will pick up our legacy and continue to move forward? The old Prime Minister shook his head. "We do not believe, so the people of Cruz cannot shed blood and sacrifice everything for this land called Saint Tossol. But 1,000 years ago, we both believed in this. If that oath was still there, the kings who signed that oath left this world one by one. But today, their descendants were faced with the same choice." "Child," the old Prime Minister suddenly spoke to Faina, "do you understand the meaning of your decision?" Faina nodded. Of course she understood, but this was also a heavy task. The weight of the ring was not only the weight of the Empire. It was also a trust. Delphine's trust in her, Brando's trust in the elves and humans, the people's trust in the ancient oath, and Her Highness Constance's trust in the person she chose. She believed that the last task she gave before her death would change the fate of this world forever. At that moment, the meaning of royalty and country had already succumbed to the survival of civilization. And this was the power of order. She stretched out her hand, opening her palm to reveal the beautiful ring. It looked very ordinary, made of pure gold without any decorations, only the emblem of a flame shining brightly under the light of the furnace. It was as if a flame was burning in the eyes of everyone present. The old Prime Minister looked at the ring and nodded. But then he smiled bitterly. The old man knew in his heart who was the one standing in front of him in this game of chess. He had never failed in his life, but in the end, he was stabbed in the back by his own granddaughter. He really raised a good granddaughter. He turned his head and said, "Your Excellency the Great Saint, Your Highness the Prince, you heard it. Now, come in." Faina was shocked when she heard this, and when she saw the two people who came in, her beautiful eyes widened. Chapter 1508. Before Yeruta left, he felt the uneasiness in his heart again. He looked back at his sister, Peya, and the King of Lorindale. In the corridor ahead, the tall French arched windows were lined with each other, and the soft sunlight shone through the glass on the ground, leaving a bright mark every few meters. Through the light, dust fluttered, and light and shadow intertwined to form a deep space. At the end of the corridor, it seemed to lead to an unknown world. And Istiville looked at him calmly, and his thin face was more serious than ever. "Go, Your Highness," he said. "But I don't know if I can do it." Yeruta was a little afraid, and because of this, he shrank back. Istiville said to him, "The King of Saint Tossol must make his own decisions." "But what if it's wrong?" Yeruta asked. "Here's how we go about doing something. We think it over and over again in advance, and then we make up our minds. Once we've made up our minds, we have to show the courage to take responsibility for it," said Istowl. "No one can avoid making mistakes, but they can't be muddle-headed. Have you thought it over, Your Highness?" "I have, Mr. Istiville. I think Brother Brando's decision is right. In this common war, we should be more united, shouldn't we?" "So you've made up your mind?" Yeruta nodded thoughtfully. "Then if you're wrong, you'll be criticized for it." "Are you afraid of criticism?" Istiville asked. "No, I'm not afraid, Mr. Istiville," Yeruta said. "Because I believe our starting point is right. Even if there is a setback for a while, it won't be because of the resolution itself. I'll find the root of the problem and correct it. I'm not afraid of difficulties, because difficulties can always be overcome." The King of Lorindale couldn't help but be infected by the boy's spirit. It's always good to be simple. Perhaps he will encounter many things in the future and find that the world is not as simple as he thought. But as long as there is this heart, then all difficulties can always be overcome. "In that case, what else do you have to worry about, Your Highness?" he asked again. Yeruta's eyes dimmed. "But I am your crown prince, am I not? Aren't you worried that I am close to Mr. Brando? Do you think that your future king will listen to an outsider and put the interests of Saint Tossol before the interests of other countries? Is that why he made such a decision?" After hearing this question, Istiville laughed and said, "Your Highness, the elves are not ungrateful people." He looked at the human youth with even more admiration in his eyes. "The fact that you can say these words today proves that you are the same as us. Wind Empress's insight is indeed extraordinary." But Yeruta still didn't quite understand what the elf lord meant. Istiville continued, "Your Highness, do you really think that Count Tonajol made the right choice?" To this, Yeruta nodded without hesitation. "That's enough," Istiville replied loudly. "As long as you think it's really right, you can go ahead and do it. The elves will be behind you as your solid backing." Hearing this answer, Yeruta was stunned. The attitude of the King of Lorindale was completely beyond his expectations. And his sister, the huntress Peya, came up as if no one else was around. As the daughter of the mountain people, she didn't have much to say, and just silently put the sacred ring of the Wind Empress in the palm of her brother's hand. Although silent, her soft eyes had contained all the words she wanted to say to her brother. It was a traditional and tenacious quality that the mountain people had adhered to for generations. It was simple, but it was beautiful. Yoruda held the sacred ring in his hand, and the ring shone brightly in the darkness. The elves looked at this scene, and the long line bent down one by one, like a silver wave, on both sides of the promenade, facing the future king forward. The youth looked at this scene, and suddenly a trickle of warmth flowed through his heart. It was like a whisper whispering in his ear, the glory and faith of this elf kingdom for thousands of years. It was an ancient recognition. The youth felt a little bitter at the corner of his eyes, and he gently raised his hand and wiped it with the back of his hand. He swore that he would not let anyone down. Everything was coming to an end. Veronica looked at the hands that were raised like a mountain forest, and the depression and disappointment in her heart became more and more pervasive. It was true that no one in this world would want to die, and in the face of death, everyone was equally fearful. Especially after the hot blood had dissipated, there was only the instinct to live. This was also the need for the continuation of any race, and perhaps it was not shameful. But compared to death, what was more terrible was the loss of hope. A mortal's life, compared to the long history, was like a moment. Conferring the title of wife and children, and achieving success and fame were the needs of life, but when death came, everything returned to nothingness. Then for thousands of years, people seemed to repeat this process repeatedly in their busy lives. What was the point of existence? There were very few people who had doubts about their life. This was because civilizations and races composed of individuals were built on countless gravel. Gravel came and went, empires rose and fell, honor and disgrace, and history moved forward, but it eventually left a mark. The people of the mortal world changed the world and the future little by little. Perhaps everyone was repeating the process from life to death, but today and tomorrow were different after all. Perhaps the future and hope were the ultimate answer to this question. However, at this moment, this answer had lost its meaning. In her disappointment, Veronica heard a noble next to her choking, "Thank God, I can finally leave this damned place. I'm scared every day, afraid that one day I'll never see my family again. As long as the elves allow us to enter, I'll immediately take my family and move to Chronicles. If the Twilight Dragon attacks that place, I'll find a way to go to the Nine Phoenix." Veronica turned around and saw the tear-stained noble. She did not know what kind of mood made her ask the other party, "After the Nine Phoenix, where will we go?" The noble could not answer and was stunned for a moment. Veronica saw this and shook her head. She suddenly felt a little dispirited. She separated the crowd and walked out, wanting to leave this place. But at a glance, she saw Duke Ludwig still sitting not far away. It was sad to say that the other party was the first to stand firmly against her, but in the vote, he unexpectedly chose to abstain. Duke Ludwig sat in his seat at a loss. He wanted to reach for his pocket watch several times, but his hands were trembling so badly that he could only grab empty air. Veronica looked at this person and understood that perhaps between the two ways of hanging, the latter had chosen the crueler way. He had obliterated her hope. But perhaps the others could leave with more dignity because of this. Even though Veronica wanted to say something, in front of Duke Ludwig who seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant, she found it difficult to speak. She felt a sense of suffocation in her heart. Staying in this fortress might not be the right choice, but where was the right choice? Could it be that she had lost all hope? She could stay here and die generously. But what about the others? At the corner of the round table, Great Druid Grey Fury saw this scene and shook his head. He got up and left his seat. The craftsman wizards of the Silver Alliance were also leaving. Although they did not express any opinions from the beginning, the wizards were only discussing with each other, shaking their heads from time to time. There were few smiles on their faces. Only the representatives of the Highlanders and the Highlanders were still sitting in their seats, looking at the representatives of Silver Bay on the other side as if it had nothing to do with them. These small nobles were discussing whether they should stay or leave. More importantly, how should the allied forces of Silver Bay be saved? The people of Fanzan also got up and tidied up the various parchments on the table. Behind them, the envoys of the various states of White City had left earlier and were walking out in groups. The hall was noisy, and some people even nodded at Great Druid Grey Fury. But then, the wind elves in the hall who had been watching coldly from the sidelines suddenly stood up in unison and looked towards the south door of the hall. Veronica was about to leave when she noticed that not far away, Duke Ludwig, who had been oblivious to the changes in his surroundings, had a look of surprise on his face. He stood up shakily from his seat and looked straight behind her. She subconsciously turned around. Many people were also turning around. The Bugis stopped outside the north door, and the envoys of the various states of White City were blocked behind them. Both sides were turning around and looking in this direction. The people who were still in their seats stopped what they were doing. The people of Fanzan looked at their colleagues, and the representatives of Silver Bay looked at each other. Great Druid Grey Fury slowed down his steps and turned around, looking in their direction with some surprise. Crack! A light sound was heard. The door to the south was pushed open with a creaking sound. The hall fell silent for a moment, because people saw rows of elven guards in silver armor and winged helmets pouring in from outside the door and escorting a human youth into the hall. All the wind elves in the hall bowed subconsciously at this moment. But what they bowed to was not the human youth. It was the thing in the youth's hand. It was a ring. Under everyone's gaze, Yoruda walked down the stairs with the holy ring in his hand and came to the round table where the elven representatives were sitting. He raised his head and looked at all the nobles in the hall, then raised the ring and gently placed it on the table. On the ring, the 9-patterned sacred emblem of Saint Tossol shone in the dim light in the center of the hall. The ring of the Wind Empress. Someone with sharp eyes recognized him and blurted out in surprise. Veronica's gaze froze, and she felt her heart beat faster. Not far away, the great druid's face also showed surprise. Yoruda looked at everyone present. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were also focused on the son of the former hunter. But there was no sign of retreat in the youth's heart. On the contrary, there was only infinite courage surging in his chest. Because today, he understood what he was going to do. It represented a promise that had not been realized for 1,000 years. 1,000 years later, it would be realized again in the hands of the descendants of the Mist Elves, in the hands of today's Wind Elves. A long overdue promise. Yoruda said quietly, "The Wind Elves of Saint Tossol are willing to stay and guard this fortress." The voice that echoed over the hall was not loud, and it even sounded a little childish. But every word weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at the seats of the crew's people, and the hall was so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. The crew's nobles were stunned. Are these elves crazy? The Bugis stopped whispering to each other, and beside them, the great druid sat back in his seat thoughtfully, as if waiting for something. Only the wind elves stared at the ring, and then looked at their future king with a serious expression. Yoruda spoke again, "Then former allies, the descendants of the Flame King, where are they today? Do you still remember your oath?" Veronica subconsciously wanted to separate the crowd and return to her seat. How could the crew's people break their promise? Even if it was in her own name, she must stay and fight side by side with the elves. But before she could open her mouth, a clear and powerful voice had already answered for her. "The crew's people are here. Who's talking? Who dares to represent the crew's people without authorization?" A noble counselor stood up, shaking his fat head and looking around, trying to find the person who spoke. But his words were immediately stuck in his throat. The crowd was parting left and right, automatically making a path. In the middle of that path, the heavily armored Flame family knights stood opposite each other, and 16 knights escorted a girl into the hall. The blonde girl also held up a ring in her hand. But it was more like a flame. The golden flame ring was burning on her hand. Someone in the crowd swallowed the holy ring of fire. Vahina walked down the stairs step by step and came to the round table. She looked at the young hunter in front of her. Then she solemnly put the ring in her hand on the table, raised her head and replied to the wind elves, "The 2 rings bear witness to this oath, the crew's people are willing to fight side by side with former allies." The elves nodded. "We may have had a grudge, behind Yeruda, Istavil, the king of Lorendale, replied, "but today it's all written off. We were comrades 1,000 years ago, and it's the same today." "By the holy ring," the elves replied in unison. Yeruda looked at the noble daughter with some admiration. He also raised the holy ring of the Wind Empress, and replied with the same solemnity, "By the holy ring," in mid-air. 2 holy rings that were shining brightly, facing each other. Everything was like the scene 1,000 years ago. "It's a pity that there are only 2. The great druid looked at this scene and could not help but sigh. Perhaps the era of the 7 precepts had long been a thing of the past. At the top of the city of Candlebell, the defense line of the Silver Bay Coalition army was falling apart. But the real despair in the hearts of the people did not come from the overwhelming Dusk army. Blank stood behind the battlements with a solemn face. Beside him, Nun Princess Magadal was covering her mouth, looking at the scene in horror. It was a gigantic black sphere that was revealing itself outside Canderbell City. "Martha above, what the hell is that, White Mountain?" The wind elves and the vampires stood facing each other. The 26 representatives looked at each other, pulled out chairs, and sat on both sides of a long table. After looking at both sides for a moment, the clerk quietly picked up a quill and wrote the first sentence on the parchment. "An era has passed." The huge silver dragon flapped its wings and landed on the ruins of a city. Delphian was the first to jump down from the silver dragon's back. She landed on the ground. Other than the Buga envoy who came to greet her, she also saw 2 unexpected people. Huang Hua and Fang Qi stood facing each other. The former looked at her and smiled. "You're here, Miss Delphian, Fanzin's eastern border, Great Glacier." The Elven Queen looked at the ice mountain shining with purple light in the distance. Her people, the Wild Elf army, were falling in waves on the way to attack. Fanzin's night had gathered into a torrent, but they were still unable to tear a hole in the No Races defense line. Suddenly, a purple light flashed in the sky. She looked up in the cold wind, as if she suddenly realized something. "It has finally begun, the final battle that has been going on for 1,000 years, Erewhon, Lighthouse Citadel." In the underground black prison, the girl looked up at the only ray of light that shone down from the ceiling. Her hands and feet were shackled with heavy iron shackles, and with the slightest movement, the iron chains locked on the wall rattled. After a moment, she closed her eyes silently. She was no stranger to darkness. Rosy blood dripped along the cold metal. Brando. Chapter 1509. With a creak, Amandina raised her head in the darkness and turned her stiff neck. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw someone open the iron door, and the jailer led the others in from outside. Then came the sound of flint striking, and soon the light of a fire lit up. The bright torch was held in the hands of the clumsy woman, and the light shone into Amandina's eyes, causing her to squint uncomfortably. Outside the iron door stood 2 knights in addition to the woman. They wore armor that was very different from the style of Erewhon, and the metal armor reflected a bright luster in the light of the fire. The 2 knights, one older and the other younger. "Let her out." The older knight ordered the woman who was in charge of Amandina's custody. "Wait, my lord, she's shackled." The woman took out a bunch of keys and quickly replied, "Let me unlock it for her first." "Then hurry up," the knight said impatiently. The woman came to Amandina's side and grabbed the shackles on her hands. Amandina struggled symbolically, but to no avail. The former deftly inserted the key into the hole and twisted it, and the shackles on her hands fell off with a clatter. The shackles were connected to the wall of the dungeon with an iron chain. It was only a few meters long, and within the range of the chain, she could not leave her bed. The dungeon was dark and damp, full of a moldy smell, and there was a messy pile of straw in the corner. Occasionally, a few rats could be seen scurrying over it. The young knight frowned as he looked at the environment. He looked at the heavy metal shackles on the ground, and then looked at the scars on the female prisoner's snow-white wrists, and could not help but feel sympathy. Who is this woman? Is she an extremely powerful witch? Oh, the older knight chuckled. Don't underestimate her, this woman is not simple. I heard that she is the princess of this small country. But be careful, Wizard Sadr wants to see her, don't cause any problems for me. The young knight let out a hollow laugh and quickly nodded in agreement. Amandina felt the shackles on her feet lighten, and the clumsy woman unlocked the shackles on her feet. But the woman obviously did not know what it meant to have tender feelings for a woman, or perhaps it was jealousy. She purposely used force when she lifted Amandina's ankle, causing Amandina to frown in pain. But of course, Amandina would not bow to a mere maid. She gritted her teeth and stood up. Although the conditions here were not as good as her home in Brags, it was not too far off. She did not say a word, but in her heart, she was secretly paying attention to the situation at the moment. She had been locked up here for more than half a month. It was as if the other party had forgotten about her existence and only allowed this careless woman to guard her. What was going on today? In this half a month, Amandina had basically confirmed her location. This should be the lighthouse near Kirkle. She could see a large number of black pine trees outside the castle when she was outside. These trees that she was familiar with were widely distributed in the Grimoires province. There was a river near the castle that flowed into a bright body of water in the distance, but she did not know whether it was a lake or the sea. But it should be a lake. Grimoires was not close to the sea, but it was close to the largest lake in Erewhon, Lake Valendon. Amandina had been to another famous castle in the Grimoires province during the Second War of the Black Rose, Fort Vermeer near Brags. But the layout there was very different from here, and it was unlikely that these people would send her to Madara's undead territory. After confirming her location, the thing she wanted to do the most was to send this information out, but the woman guarding her was stubborn. Even though she would occasionally tell her about the situation outside, Amandina always felt that it was because there was someone behind her who ordered her to do so. What are these people planning to do with me? She felt that these people were not from Erewhon. Amandina did not forget that she was brought to this place as Princess Griffin. Even if the people of Erewhon did not know the princess, they should at least know that the current heir of the royal family of Corvado had mixed elven blood. However, the knights and wizards who escorted her ignored her identity. Knights and wizards were close to nobles in Erewhon, especially the head of a knight. Once a person was conferred the title of a baron, it was unlikely that these people did not know about the members of the royal family of their own country. It was impossible that they did not know about Princess Griffin's hair color and basic appearance. This princess was not one of the dozens of daughters of the kings of other countries. King Oberg VII only had one daughter, and the princess was not unknown in Erewhon. However, the indifference shown by the people who captured her towards the princess's identity was very strange. More importantly, the words of the elder knight made her heart skip a beat. Don't underestimate her. This woman is not simple. I heard that she is the princess of this small country. But be careful, Wizard Sadr wants to see her. Don't cause any trouble. The princess of this small country. They were not from Erewhon. But where were they from? Why were they in Erewhon? If they said that Erewhon was a small country, then their country must be very big. Even if it was not as big as the four great empires, it should not be comparable to a small kingdom or dukedom. She first confirmed that these people were not from Cruz. The Cruz people's golden hair color and blue eyes were their most obvious characteristics. Even the mixed-blood people more or less retained this characteristic. What's more, Cruz was close to Erewhon, and the relationship between the two countries was still messy. Even if the Cruz people did not take Erewhon seriously, they should have at least heard of the princess's reputation. After all, the princess was known throughout the Silver Bay coastal states for her appearance. Amandina suddenly thought of another title that the other party mentioned. Wizard Sadr. She was slightly startled, but then her heart skipped a beat. Wasn't that the leader of the Bugis? Amandina had a good memory, and her knowledge was something that few people in Trondheim could match. Although she did not know the Bugis as well as Brendel did, she at least knew the names of the 12 leaders of the Bugis wizards. Could it be that the Bugis were behind this? Amandina suddenly felt a chill in her heart. If the mastermind behind this conspiracy was really the Bugis, then how could she resist? How could Erwin resist these high and mighty silver people? The more she thought about it, the more flustered she became. She was suddenly afraid that Brando would come to her rescue. That was the leader of the Bugis. No matter how powerful he was, how could he be a match for the best of the silver people? Every leader of the Bugis had existed for a long time. Even the youngest of them, Silverfire Tulaman, had existed for 100 or 200 years. And Wizard Sadr was one of the most powerful of them. In fact, it was said that the power of this wizard was only second to a few super first-rate existences in the Silver Alliance. Those few people were Solomon, William, and Harianov. But maybe not. Amandina bit her lower lip. These people might be intimidating her, just to break her psychological defenses. It was not that she did not have such doubts in her heart. After all, the Bugis had not interfered in the affairs of the surface for hundreds of years. Why would they suddenly break their own tradition? Help her up. At this time, the older knight spoke to the jailer. The clumsy woman came over and was about to lift her arm, but Amandina frowned and swept her hand away, standing up on her own. The knight looked at her in surprise, but did not say anything. Amandina looked at the two knights and suddenly remembered another legend. Could these people be the legendary Banksians? Legend had it that the Banksians were slaves of magic. The Banksians were obsessed with magic and worshipped the Bugis in the sky. In the year of the dragon's fall, this people voluntarily became the followers of the Sossalds. Among the Banksians, there were generally only two professions, wizard or knight. The arcane knight was a specialty of the Banksians. Knights were often the guards and followers of wizards, and it was said that for any Banksians, becoming a knight of the Silver Folk was their highest honor. Just like the Bugis, every Bansien was a potential wizard. Those who could not become wizards would be eliminated to participate in knight training, and those who could not become wizards or knights would be demoted to lowly jobs like craftsmen and merchants. Because every Bansien knight was an eliminated wizard, they often spent a lot of time learning magic knowledge. This caused them to be much weaker in terms of combat skills and physique compared to the real knights who were trained as knights from a young age. However, there were gains and losses. After the baptism of the mana pool, the Bansien arcane knight could cast magic while wearing heavy armor. This gave them a great advantage in battles with other human and elven knights. As a result, the reputation of the arcane knight spread like wildfire. When Amandina saw the senior knight use an invisible force to open the door to the dungeon, the last shred of hope in her heart was extinguished. They really were the Bansien knight. Could the Sassard Alliance be far away? When she read about this from the books, she never thought that she would one day meet the Banksians like this. She had once longed for the vastness and wonders of the world, the beauty of the 9 phoenixes, the vastness of the Rubik Desert, the desolation and barrenness of the Sea of the Dying Moon, and the different ecology of the mortal kingdoms under the Sassard Alliance and the 4 great empires. She also had a dream to see the places described in the books with her own eyes. But today, when one of her long-cherished wishes came true, Amandina felt a chill in her heart. She silently followed behind the two, her hands clenched into fists. Her fingertips were white and her nails were almost digging into her flesh, but she did not feel any pain. It was as if all the blood in her body was flowing back. She did not even know how she managed to walk this distance. This really was the lighthouse. When she saw the main structure of the castle, she had already confirmed this. The lighthouse was built in the year 447 under the supervision of a wind elf, so the main structure of the castle was left with the aesthetic style of the elves. The bard Cody once said that this castle was one of the most beautiful castles in the Erewhon Kingdom, and it lived up to its reputation. But Amandina was not in the mood to admire it. Why would the Sassard Alliance suddenly be interested in a small country like the Erewhon Kingdom? Why would they want to capture the princess? No, Amandina shook her head in her heart. These people's real goal was to find someone with the pure bloodline of the Erewhon Kingdom, but this bloodline was not limited to the Corvado royal family, otherwise she would not be able to pass the test. Could it be that the royal bloodline of the Erewhon Kingdom was hiding some kind of secret? But if that was the case, shouldn't the purest royal bloodline be the descendants of House Cypher? Why would they look for the siblings of the Corvado royal family? Her heart was filled with doubts. 2 knights guarded Amandina as she entered through the main door, passed through the hall, and went up the stairs. Amandina looked on coldly as she continued to fill in her guesses. After being imprisoned for half a month, the other party suddenly asked to see her. Why was that? Perhaps the other party had completely controlled the situation in the Erewhon Kingdom and was ready to lay all their cards on the table. Or perhaps there was another reason. They needed an insider familiar with Princess Griffin to confirm her identity. And this person had already arrived. She quickly ruled out the first possibility. According to what the maid told her about the situation outside, although the rebels had the upper hand, they had yet to turn it into a victory. They had not even captured the real princess, and the situation was still very worrying. It seemed that the Sassard Alliance was not completely without scruples and had not completely made their move. Of course, Amandina did not know that because of the White Mountain disaster, the Sassard Alliance's grey mages were divided into 2, and the main force was not in the Erewhon Kingdom. Of course, for these high and mighty silver folk, this small number of people was far enough to overturn this small kingdom. Since that was the case, there was only the second possibility left. Who would be the one who would come? Knight Amandina had long suspected that there was a traitor in the royal faction. Otherwise, these Banksians would not have been able to find her and her highness so accurately and attack Prince Haruz, who was on a diplomatic mission in Lantern Island. This traitor must not be a member of the local nobles because they did not have the ability to access core secrets, and it could not be an old noble because the old nobles could not gain the trust of her highness. So this person could only be a member of the royal faction, and must be a core member. Although Amandina was very reluctant to believe that there would be such a crazy person in the royal faction, which once represented Erewhon's beliefs, the facts could not be ignored. A few names instantly appeared in her mind. These names even included the person she was closest to and most trusted. After all, everyone knew about his relationship with the Bugas. Amandina almost bit her lip until it bled. Although she would never believe that the Lord would betray Erewhon, her natural calmness and rationality made her have to consider this possibility. But whether it was the Lord or not, as long as it was anyone on this list, it was enough to have a devastating blow to the kingdom. Amandina couldn't help but feel gloomy. Everyone often hated traitors more than enemies, and she was no exception. The pain of being betrayed was difficult for outsiders to understand. Amandina clenched her teeth so hard that they almost broke. If hatred could kill, then the real traitor would have died a long time ago. After walking through a long passage in silence, the knight stopped. The young knight took 2 steps forward and knocked on the wooden door in front of them. With a creak, the wooden door opened, and a small head popped out from behind, staring at the 3 of them warily. It was the first time Amandina had seen such a strange magical creature. The other party had a wide nose and big ears, full of distrust towards humans, and asked in a shrill voice, "What are you doing? The master is receiving a guest." The 2 knights did not dare to be negligent. They knew that this demon was one of Wizard Sadra's attendants, and quickly replied, "My lord wants to see her." The demon glanced at Amandina, and that gloomy gaze made Amandina feel as if she had been stabbed by a sword, and her face turned pale. But fortunately, the demon quickly withdrew his gaze and nodded, "I'll go and report, you stay here." With that, he closed the door. But it was at this moment that a reprimand came from inside the door. It was a woman's angry scream. "Those trash that you promised me are all done for. Sodr, you'd better take care of your own troubles. Don't let them affect your other plans. That hateful woman really didn't put the throne of destiny in the stagnation realm, and now I can confirm that it is here, but it's not that simple, you'd better be careful," another voice hurriedly explained. "No, my lord, listen to me, it's just a little trouble. I didn't expect Erwin's people to have the strength to resist, it must be those damn fellows from the Silver Society. But it doesn't matter, I'm mobilizing my men stationed near White Mountain, my lord, you have to believe that mere mortals can't stop the Silver Folk. As for Tanajal's trouble." This voice obviously belonged to Wizard Sodr, but Amandina was slightly puzzled, who could make this wizard leader tremble in fear? Could that woman be the mastermind behind all of this? The woman's voice coldly interrupted Baron Sodr. "Don't worry about Tanajal anymore, the beacon is already in that person's hands, what you have to do is to find the key first. I hope you can do this well this time, don't let me down again, Sodr, you know what will happen to you. Besides," she paused, "don't blame me for not reminding you, if you don't really take your opponent seriously, I think you may not be able to leave this place. But in that case, you don't have to worry about what your opponents will do to you, anyway, you don't need to know this." Amandina wanted to continue listening, but she suddenly heard a scream. The wooden door in front of her suddenly shattered into pieces, and a black shadow flew out. It was the spirit from before, but it had already crashed into the wall not far away. Blood flowed out from its head as it breathed its last. Then a young girl stepped on the debris on the ground and walked out. In the smoke, the young girl saw Amandina and softly made a sound of surprise. Amandina froze at the same time, because she actually saw the merchant girl. No, that wasn't completely the Roman girl. Because although her size and appearance were exactly the same as the merchant girl, her temperament and demeanor were completely different, and her black hair was completely different from the somewhat curly brown hair of the merchant girl, and her eyes were actually a bright gold. Those eyes made her somewhat flirtatious appearance full of majesty, like two blazing golden flames. She looked up at Amandina, who was not taller than her, and her eyes were filled with surprise. You. Amandina's heart was filled with fear. "You're Dusk," the merchant girl smiled slightly. She stretched out her snow-white and slender fingers, and lifted Amandina's chin, even though the latter was already much taller than her. "Look at who this is, my dear Amandina." She smiled, turned her head, and said to Sorcerer Sodr who had chased after her, "This is the key you found, Princess Erwin." "My lady," Sorcerer Sodr was shocked, and just as he was about to say something, Amandina coldly looked at him, and a cloud of black fog had already surged out of her petite body, turning into a black cloud and disappearing from the corridor. "Just you wait, Sodr, you better not ruin my plans." Amandina's shrill voice echoed in the corridor. "And my dear friend, I will cherish the memories between us, but farewell forever." Amandina's face was white as a sheet. Chapter 15:10. The merchant girl's shrill laughter lingered in the corridor as she slowly disappeared into the distance. The two Bansha knights stared at the scene with their mouths agape as the black smoke dissipated into the corridor. Sorcerer Sodr's dark gaze swept over them. "What are you waiting for?" he said coldly. "Clean this place up." The two knights, one old and one young, hurriedly lowered their heads and acknowledged. Sodr turned around and looked at Amandina from head to toe. The woman's words before she left made him feel that something was wrong. "Are you the princess of this kingdom?" Amandina looked into his eyes without fear, her gaze clear and firm, but she did not say a word. Sodr snorted coldly in his heart when he saw this. He knew that his hypnosis did not work. Even though a wizard's mind control spell was powerful, it had to be built on the premise that the target was not on guard. If the target was familiar with your methods, then the chances were even slimmer. He was afraid that he would damage the little girl's brain, so he did not continue. With a dark expression, he gestured to Amandina to follow him. Even though Amandina did not reply, she knew that it was pointless for her to resist, so she followed him silently. The two of them entered a study. Sorcerer Sodr did not speak, and took out a communication ruby from a drawer and rubbed it twice with his fingers. After about 15 minutes, there was a knock on the door. Mr. Sodr. Amandina heard the voice and felt all the blood in her body rush to her brain. Even though she had expected it, she could not help but tremble in anger. Sorcerer Sodr knocked on the table, and the door opened by itself. Amandina raised her head and looked at the person outside. Her gaze was like two sharp swords that pierced towards the person. The person outside the door did not expect to meet such a terrifying gaze, and could not help but take a step back. But when he saw who the owner of the gaze was, his expression changed. Why is it you? Who is she? Before Amandina could say anything, Sodr, who already had a bad premonition, spoke first. He sat motionless in his seat, his face dark and gloomy to the point of being frightening. The person who came was Makarov. This was the confidant of the royal faction, the cunning fox of Lantern Island, the confidant of the Grand Duke of Carnot. The traitor was wearing a gray, black fur coat. The hat on his head was covered with dew, rain, and snow, and his boots were covered with half-dried mud. He looked like he had just arrived at Lighthouse not long ago and had not had time to rest after a long journey. Amandina looked at his pitiful appearance and sneered in her heart. The dignified minister of Erwin's court was acting so carefully, wagging his tail and begging for mercy. Did he look like the leader of the royal faction at all? Was this the lifelong pursuit of this man? Indeed, he got what he asked for. My lord, there's a problem. Makarov knew what Amandina's gaze meant, but he ignored it and answered respectfully, "This is not the princess, she is the mistress of Count Tonajol. She is also a powerful woman." "I didn't expect you to be such a despicable person, Makarov." Amandina looked at the traitor and said coldly, "You betrayed the princess and slandered the relationship between my lord and myself. Do you think everyone is as filthy as you? How dare you call her princess?" Makarov was about to retort, but Sorcerer Sodr shouted angrily, "All of you, shut up." He suddenly stretched out his hand, and a bolt of lightning shot out from his fingertips and struck Amandina's chest. Amandina screamed in pain as she crashed into a bookshelf. She felt a sharp pain in her back as the bookshelf fell on top of her, and the books fell heavily on top of her, burying her under them. Blood gushed out from all over her body, and there was a salty taste in her mouth. She coughed weakly and felt like she was about to faint. But she heard Sorcerer Sodr's voice from outside, "You better give me an explanation, Makarov." My lord." Makarov suppressed his uneasiness and tried to explain. "I don't quite understand. My subordinates were the ones who captured her, but the item was given to me. Do you think my subordinates dared to lie to me?" Wizard Sodr sat in his seat, his gloomy face like a dark cloud that was brewing a storm. "Now that we've captured her, you're telling me she's not the princess?" "My lord. I understand." Makarov gulped and racked his brains to understand the problem. "Can I see it?" Sorcerer Sodr snorted coldly and tossed a gemstone to Makarov. It was the Gorlan gemstone that was used to verify Amandina's bloodline when she was captured by the Banksians. Makarov silently took the gemstone and examined it carefully. This gemstone was originally a part of the Lionheart sword. It was embedded in the hammer of the sacred sword by the first generation of swordsmiths as a symbol of Erwin's authority. Later, during the Battle of Balta, the jewel was lost from the sword, and the knights only found it a year later. After that, the late King Eric used it to make a crown, which has been the treasure of House Cipher ever since. After the fall of House Cipher, this crown naturally fell into the hands of House Covardo. Its last owner was King Oberg VII. Before this muddle-headed king died, he entrusted the crown to the royal faction for safekeeping. In fact, this crown had always been in the hands of Makarov and Oberway. Makarov carefully examined the gemstone that emitted a bright light. He flipped it over and over for a long time, but he could not figure out what was wrong with it. He swore that this gemstone was the real Gorlan gemstone, but why would there be such a problem? After a while, the traitor raised his head in confusion while holding the gem. Looking at his expression, Sorcerer Sadr knew that it was a waste of time. Are you trying to say that I made a mistake? My lord, Makarov broke out in cold sweat. He might be someone important in Erewhon, but he was nothing in front of the people of House Cipher. Just as he was about to find an excuse to explain himself, a hoarse sneer came from under the overturned bookshelf. Mr. Sorcerer, why are you letting him continue to deceive you? Makarov subconsciously turned his head around. He saw the bookshelf being pushed open by a pair of weak arms. A young girl covered in wounds struggled to get up from below. Books and debris fell from her body like rain, but in the end, the young girl staggered to her feet. She looked at the two people in the room, and her gaze finally landed on Sorcerer Sadr. My lord, she. Makarov realized that something was wrong and quickly spoke. But Sorcerer Sadr was expressionless, and even the anger on his face disappeared. Let her continue. Makarov could only obediently shut his mouth, but his expression was one of anger. Give me the gemstone. Amandina did not intend to let him go, and coldly looked at the traitor. The Gorlan gemstone is Erewhon's sacred item. How can it be given to a traitor like you? What are you trying to do? Makarov felt that something was wrong. Amandina did not answer him, and only looked at Sorcerer Sadr. Give it to her. Sorcerer Sadr replied as expected. My lord, be careful, she might break the gemstone. Give it to her. Sorcerer Sadr emphasized. Makarov had no choice but to do as he was told. He was known as the cunning fox of Lantern Island, but even the most cunning fox would not dare to act rashly in front of a real lion. Even though he had a stomach full of tricks, they were useless here. Amandina took the gemstone, and the seemingly ordinary Gorlan gemstone immediately bloomed with light the moment it touched her hand. When the gemstone was stained with her blood, it suddenly shone brightly. It was as if a ball of fire had lit up in the center of the gemstone. It slowly expanded outwards, and finally became bright and flawless, emitting a gentle light in all directions. The girl held the gemstone with both hands, and it was as if she was holding up the sun. The dazzling light shone in all directions, and Makarov did not dare to look at it directly. Even Sorcerer Sadr, who was not far away, could not help but squint his eyes. This. Makarov was dumbfounded. He covered his eyes with his hands and shouted. How is this possible? But Sorcerer Sadr was much calmer, and he only looked at Amandina thoughtfully. Amandina put down the gemstone, and as if it was her will, the light from the gemstone gradually faded with her movements. She raised her head, and looked straight into Sorcerer Sadr's eyes. Her expression was calm as she said, the person you found is not reliable at all. He doesn't even understand the true meaning of the Gorlan gemstone, and he actually tried to use it to find Princess Griffine. What a joke. After saying this, Amandina closed her mouth. She only waited in silence. But in her heart, she was extremely nervous. She was gambling, but if she guessed wrong, she would die immediately. Fortunately, she did not make a mistake on the crucial point. Don't try to sow discord, Sadr said coldly. No matter what you know, little girl, you can only live if you prove your worth. What I mean is, Amandina was unmoved, and replied with the same indifference, you have found the wrong person. Even though the House of Kovardo rules Erewhon today, they are still usurpers. At this moment, Makarov finally recovered from his shock. When he heard this sentence, an almost non-existent possibility flashed through his mind. Wait, you mean? Amandina looked at him with some disgust. She reached out and pulled out a necklace from her neck. The necklace that had lost its pendant lightly swayed in her hand, and shone under the afternoon sun. Do you recognize this, Mr. Cunning Fox? Cypher's heart. Makarov almost took a step back. You are the heir to the House of Cypher. Wait a moment, Sadr suddenly interrupted the two of them impatiently. What is this? You said that she is also an heir to the House of Kovardo. Do you mean that there are more than 2 heirs to the House of Kovardo? But this does not match the information I received. My lord, that is not the case. Makarov did not dare to delay and quickly explained the history of Erewhon. Only then did he explain why there were 2 royal bloodlines in this kingdom. He talked about the Battle of Grey Mountain, the change of the House of Kovardo, and the rise of the House of Kovardo. Sadr finally stopped him impatiently and waved his hand. All right, I am not interested in these trivial matters, and I don't care how many kings were born in this small place. In fact, this is only a question for you. Does this little girl meet the requirements? Makarov was stunned for a moment. He then awkwardly replied. My lord, if what she said is true, then I think she should meet the requirements. The sacred Lionheart sword was originally wielded by the late King Eric, and he was the ancestor of House Cypher. This girl is a direct descendant of Elkin III. Compared to the current House of Cypher, this branch has more legitimacy to inherit the throne. Get to the point, Sadr said. In other words, even if we find the princess, it is very likely that it will be a waste of time. Makarov could only brace himself and explain, My lord, I am only saying that there is a possibility. As one of the leaders of the Silver Confederation, Sadr was not fooled by his words and sneered, If that's the case, then shouldn't I be thanking you for your lucky shot? Makarov broke out in cold sweat and could not say the second half of his sentence. However, Sadr shook his head. He would not make a mountain out of a molehill over such a small matter. He knew that a truly reliable person would not betray their own beliefs so easily. Only these despicable people would side with them for the slightest benefit. But without these idiots, where would the Sassold's lackeys come from? He knew the relationship between the two of them, but he did not show it. He looked at Amandina again and sized her up. He did not care who she was. She was just a commoner's heir. This kind of status was not worth mentioning in the eyes of the Sassolds. It was fine as long as she could use the sword. Sadr used the slow and leisurely tone of a magus and said, You have proven your worth, little girl. Now, tell me about your background. Amandina looked at the 2 people in the room and was silent for a moment. When Makarov told her about the history of Erewhon, her heart was filled with disgust. The history of this ancient kingdom was a source of glory to some, but to others, it was just a stepping stone that could be sold at any time. What these people trampled on was not only their own beliefs and ideals, but also the blood and sacrifice of others. Perhaps they were not even worthy of such a title. But she had already come this far. Even if it was her, she could only persevere. Amandina looked at the necklace in her hand and said softly, According to the royal family's genealogy, my original name should be Moria Elena de Cypher. My ancestor was the last king of the Cypher dynasty, Elkin III. After the Battle of Grey Mountain, my father's grandfather brought them and fled from Cypher. After that, our branch settled down in the south. My father's grandfather had a son and a daughter. The daughter's branch lost contact with the Bloodstaff when they invaded Karsuk, and we are the descendants of the other branch. After the Age of Chaos, we settled down in the area from Randner to Grimoires. We tried our best to maintain our status as nobles until my father's generation fell, but even though we have lost our status as nobles, according to the oath our clan made, I cannot abandon my ancient name. Even if my name is Amandina today, my other name will follow me for life. Sorcerer Sodra nodded in satisfaction. This is a good story, he said. I believe you will be grateful for your frankness. Otherwise, I would have turned you into a piece of charcoal a few minutes ago. In this world, only those who can prove their worth can survive. Even the Sossalds are the same. The leader of the Bugas clapped his hands, his slender and pale fingers overlapping. He seemed to be in a good mood. After listening to your story, it's time to listen to our story. I hope this story will give you some inspiration. He raised his hand and chanted an ancient and mysterious incantation. Several shadows overlapped in the air. Light and shadow weaved together and finally formed a long sword. Sorcerer Sodra stood up and pointed at the sword with his hand. I think you should recognize this sword, Miss Amandina. No, I should say Princess Moria. Of course Amandina recognized the sword. Because it was the symbol of Erewhon. It was also the symbol of House Cypher. It was the Lionheart sword. Chapter 15:11. With a wave of his hand, the Lionheart sword fell from the sky and landed in his hand. He raised the sword and looked at it carefully. The afternoon sun passed through the gaps between the blinds, forming a narrow strip of light that fell on the blade. The bright blade shone with a dazzling luster. After looking at it for a while, Satyr said, "This sword was the sword of the Lionheart King Eric when he was alive. Legend has it that this sword symbolizes ideals, and it will choose those who have the same noble beliefs as its master. But few people know that this sword was forged from the fragments of the holy sword Odorfice. The soul of the holy sword lies in the sword. Its first master was the chief of the Knight of Flame, and the ancestor of the late King Eric. About 7 centuries ago, this sword was lost in the hands of the Cruz people and came to this barren land in the south. But it wasn't as described in history, where the late King Eric stole this sword from the Cruz people. It was more like a will left behind by the Flame King before he died. The establishment of Erewhon and the interference of the Wind Elves were all for the purpose of covering up a bigger secret." As he spoke, he turned the blade and placed the Lionheart sword back on the table. "And this sword is the key to that secret." After he finished speaking, Satyr raised his head and looked at Amandina. His gaze was like a sword, but Amandina only frowned slightly. Her face did not change at all. In her heart, there was a different scene. She could still vaguely remember the scene of that summer night. The light of the Witch Queen shone brightly and covered the sky above the south. A bright belt of light stretched across the center of the night. Stars weaved together, and billions of stars fell from the sky, as if they shone into the deepest part of her memory. It was her own courtyard, and the sparkling Bragg's River in the distance. "Father, is that sword really that powerful?" Of course, Viscount Nesson smiled and patted his daughter's head. "So Annie, you have to grow up quickly." "Why?" Viscount Nesson smiled and did not speak. He patted his daughter's head again, and the latter angrily pushed away her father's hand. "Annie." Viscount Nesson remembered something. Do you remember what I told you yesterday?" "Yes, I remember. Grandfather said that we are the descendants of Elkin III, the heirs of the House of Cypher. My real name is Moria Adalina de Cypher." Viscount Nesson smiled and patted her shoulder. "You must remember that although you may never use this name in your life, the blood of the late King Eric that flows in our veins determines the responsibility we bear for this kingdom." "Responsibility?" "That is, one day, when Aween needs us to stand up for her, I hope that you will be brave." "I will be brave." The little girl's eyes twinkled. "Daddy." "Okay." Viscount Nesson laughed. "Let's go. Mother is calling us." "Oh right, when we have time, I will bring you to the villa in the suburbs to play." "Really?" Of course, I'll keep my word. But I didn't keep my word, Amandina bit her lip. In her memory, not long after that, her family sold off their property. Life seemed to have become poor all of a sudden, and that promise could no longer be fulfilled. She waited for a very long time. Her father disappeared, and her mother washed her face with tears. She became thinner day by day, and it was not until many years later that another man helped her fulfill her wish. But the courtyard and her childhood memories no longer existed. Sorcerer Sadr looked suspiciously at the complicated expression on the girl's face and asked, "What are you thinking about?" Amandina's dark eyes became clear again, and gradually became firm. She recovered from her memories and slowly shook her head. "It's nothing, just some memories about this sword, sir." "What is it?" "My lord, you should understand the significance of this sword to the descendants of House Cipher." Sadr understood and nodded. "It's fine. We can give this sword to you, little girl." Amandina did not reply. She knew that these two would not be so kind. As expected, she heard Sadr continue. "But, we must obtain the secret behind this sword. It has nothing to do with House Cipher. This sword is actually a key. Only a true descendant of the Erewhon royal family can hold it and open that door." He paused and continued. "As a direct descendant of King Eric, I think you will not disappoint us, right?" Amandina was silent for a moment. Either join or die. This was indeed a simple choice. For a long time, she did not say a word. She only silently looked at the sword. Sadr was not in a hurry. He waited for her answer without saying a word, as if he already had a card up his sleeve. After a moment, Amandina finally raised her head and answered word by word. "I understand. As a direct descendant of King Eric, I will not disappoint you." The girl said this with great seriousness. Unfortunately, Sadr and Makarov did not understand. The former's fingers caressed the smooth blade of the Lionheart's sacred sword. Then, he raised the sword and handed it over to her. But Amandina did not reach out to take it. "This is your only chance, little girl," Sadr threatened with a gloomy expression. "Take this sword, or you will leave this place." Amandina looked at him. "Yes," she said, "but I have a request." This request made Sadr pause for a moment. But after a moment of hesitation, he nodded. Since this human girl had chosen to submit, he did not want to complicate matters at this time. "I want to know about you," Amandina asked. Sadr frowned. "Don't you think you're asking for too much, little girl?" "I think this is a reasonable request, my lord," Amandina replied calmly. "I have already proven my worth, but I know nothing about you." "That's true." Sorcerer Sadr nodded. He liked dealing with smart people, especially sensible people. He felt that he was beginning to admire this little girl. "All right, this can be considered an exception. What do you want to know?" He replied. "About the Twilight Dragon." Sadr sucked in a breath of cold air. Amandina was unmoved and continued. "The plan in Erewhon is not just a game for the Sithardians, right? I don't want to be treated as the lowest chess piece." Sorcerer Sadr gave the little girl a deep look. This question did not cross his bottom line, but it was beyond his expectations. He did not know what Amandina was thinking, but he thought that she had foresight. He subconsciously looked at Makarov, and his heart was filled with disappointment. How could there be such a huge gap between people? It was not that Makarov was not cunning enough, but the level of thinking had determined many things. "Interesting," Wizard Sadr muttered. But there was nothing to hide. The Sithardians had done such a big thing, and there was no way to hide it. He paced back and forth on the spot before speaking. "Actually, the contact between the Sithardians and the Twilight Dragon is much closer than you think. About 45 years ago, a black dragon called Gwendolyn came to us. She first stayed in Oleg for 3 days, then went to Augusta. Haryanov and I met the black dragon there. Not long after that, the Sithardians had a new goal, and parted ways with their former comrades. The Dragon Queen? Amandina asked. Sorcerer Sadr nodded slowly. A trace of doubt flashed through the girl's heart. In just 3 days, you betrayed the entire Silver City because of the dragon's words. I'm not stupid, Lord Sadr. You overestimate it, Sadr sneered. Even without this fuse, the split was only a long-term inevitable result. The origin of the name Sithardian was originally a noble, a ruler, and a keeper of mysteries and knowledge. We were never on the same side as the inferior wizards of the Silver Society. There were nobles among the Bugas. There were indeed such nobles before the era of the Azure Knight. Sadr's tone was a little nostalgic. Amandina tilted her head, but the Twilight Dragon's goal is to destroy our world. You should know that. What can you gain by cooperating with it? That's the story the Holy Cathedral told you, little girl. Sorcerer Sadr smiled contemptuously. They're always so alarmist, hoping to scare the world into blindly following their rule. He put down the Lionheart sword and gestured a rune with his hand. The end of the Twilight Dragon is not so much destruction, but rather turning the world back to its original state. On the other hand, Martha's creation is also a twilight for the people of chaos. Unfortunately, we are not the people of chaos, Amandina said sarcastically. We can't think with their eyes. You can say that. Sadr spread his hands, not caring about the girl's tone. But no matter what, destruction is a serious word, so please don't use it lightly. If we can't surpass the dimension of our existence, we can't destroy the universe of this dimension. The Twilight Dragon can't do that. In fact, we prefer to use tearing down an old house as an analogy for what is happening. He made an analogy. The only thing that will be destroyed in this war is the Tiamat code created by the divine people. Tearing down an old house. A hint of anger flashed in Amandina's eyes, but what difference does it make? Without this world that Marcia cares for, when the physical world disintegrates, all existences will lose their support. How can you all be lucky enough to be spared? If everything is lost in the end, what's the point of gaining so much now? This is the root of the contradiction. Sadr's tone was unusually calm. What you said applies to most people. But there is another possibility. The chaos is not really nothingness. As long as we can transcend the existing life forms, we can obtain immortality in another sense. In other words, become a part of the Twilight Dragon. Aren't the demons a part of the Twilight Dragon? Amandina felt a wave of disgust at this logic, but she did not dare to refute and could only keep her mouth shut. Sadr looked at her expression and guessed what she was thinking. He could not help but snort coldly. You still don't seem to understand, do you? This is actually a mortal's perspective. You look at this problem from the perspective of the weak, and naturally empathize with the weak. But what do those people have to do with you? He taught Amandina, your way of thinking is not a wise way of thinking. This is a world of survival of the fittest. We can survive, but some people must be eliminated. But this is not because of us, it is because they are too weak. We can choose to save them, or we can choose not to save them, but this is not a moral necessity for us. We have no necessary responsibility for these people. Amandina was silent for a moment. But the Bugas are also a member of this world. She tried to control her tone, but there was still a faint trace of anger. You seize power from this world, and part of this power itself belongs to others. So you are strong, and some people will be weak because of you. Our ancestors have agreed to protect this world together, but now you are on the side of the Twilight Dragon. How is this not a responsibility? Protect together. Sorcerer Sadr smiled mockingly and interrupted her. I have to point out that the last internal conflict in the mortal world ended 70 days ago. Even if we didn't intervene, when have you ever truly taken responsibility for this world, in the past 1,000 years? That's because the mortals don't know anything about it. Amandina pursed her lips and suppressed her somewhat impulsive tone with difficulty. If it weren't for the magic tide, we wouldn't even know that the Twilight Dragon was about to awaken. And the Bugis have sealed everything about the past so tightly. Shouldn't they be responsible for this? Sorcerer Sadr laughed coldly. You mean to say that we have an undeniable responsibility for your tragic situation? We have never asked for anything from you, but at least it's not a knife in the back. Amandina was furious as well. The Bugis had once overthrown the Myernas with the mortals, but the Silver Folk had also taken away most of the heritage from the era of the gods and claimed to be the heirs of this heritage. They sealed the knowledge and secrets of the past in their ivory towers and used this knowledge and secrets to build today's kingdom above the clouds. The mortals, on the other hand, were like inferior people who were born to roll in the mud. When the Silver Folk re-established their glorious kingdom in just 100 years, the mortals were still struggling on the continent, trying to establish their own kingdom. So the crews, Fanzin, and Saint Tossol that the world knew today were not the crews of the Myernas, nor were they the Fanzin of the Myernas, or the Saint Tossol of the Myernas. They were the faint light of civilization that the mortals had accumulated over 1,000 years like dripping water penetrating a stone. But although the hope was slim, it still persisted tenaciously. The reason why Tumen could be respected by the 4 holy cathedrals as their teacher was not only because he had taught the saints. It was also because he had given the Iron Folk of the era after the Myernas the most precious wealth, knowledge. It was a precious treasure that even the Bugis, the allies of the mortals, cherished and carefully protected. These were the Iron Folk. They were the mortals. They inherited the name of Black Iron. This cheap, lowly, flawed, and unaesthetic metal seemed to be born at the bottom, the most inconspicuous existence, but it had only one advantage: gold was too precious. Silver was too weak. Only black iron was resilient. It was so ubiquitous that there was no need to be careful. It was so lowly and unaesthetic that it was not tainted with those arrogant qualities, and its simplicity and unpretentiousness would eventually be cast into a silent note that would completely end this era. It was a weak power of billions, but more dazzling than any name written in the epics. At that moment, Amandina finally understood Brando's choice. She also understood her own choice. She shook her head slightly. I understand. Sorcerer Sadr stopped. Amandina raised her head and looked at him. Sathard has made the right choice, let us fulfill the rest of the agreement. Makarov looked at the girl strangely from the side, feeling a little uneasy. But he did not dare to speak when he saw Sadr's expression. This was a cunning fox of the kingdom. The other person was a rising star of Tonajol. These two could be said to be the 2 most intelligent people in Erewhon in this era. But a person could only lock his own thoughts with heavy shackles. The other person ignited all the flames of his wisdom, causing everything to burn fiercely, turning into a flame that engulfed everything. At this moment, courage could be the entirety of wisdom. But wisdom was only the tip of the iceberg. Sorcerer Sadr nodded. Very well, let's return to the main topic. We have wasted too much time. He picked up the lion heart again, but before he passed it to Amandina, the leader of the Sadrs looked at her solemnly. The people of the 9 Phoenix always say unpleasant things first, and I am the same, little girl. Smart people should know how to avoid harm, and you should understand what it means to be deceived. I understand. That's good, Sorcerer Sadr said coldly. But I still have to remind you. Do you see the sword in my hand? It's the symbol of this kingdom, and just like it, you have to understand that I'm not only holding your life in my hands, but also the future of this kingdom. I don't think you want to see too many people die for you, do you? Amandina's face was a little pale. But she still nodded. Sadr nodded as well, and only then did he reverse the blade and push it forward. The lionheart swayed as it flew towards Amandina. Then, he pointed to the sword floating in the air and said to her, "That's right. Now, pick it up. Now, pick it up." It was a simple choice. But Amandina stood there for a long time, staring at the sword. It was like a distant dream. The sword was vaguely different from her father's description in her memory, but only the emblem on the sword still described its past, as if time had left a mark on it. Very few people knew the secret of the sword. But the descendants of the late King Eric were an exception. That voice echoed in her mind. "Annie, when Erwin needs us to stand up for him, I hope you will be brave." "I will, father." Amandina took a deep breath and lifted her head to look at Sorcerer Saudra. Her eyes flashed with the brightest light. "Wait, stop." When he saw the pair of firm and determined eyes, he finally realized that something was wrong. Even under Saudra's gaze, he could not help but shout. But it was too late. Amandina's hand lightly grasped the hilt of the sword. "Farewell, Brando." Chapter 15:12. By the name of Martha, Pomed, I'm going to be a father. Borgnessen waved the letter in his hand excitedly. "Oh, is that so?" A smile appeared on the stern knight's old-fashioned face. He looked at his companion with his light brown eyes. "Then I must congratulate you properly." "Of course." Borgnessen sat down next to his colleague and gazed at the Nysander forest under the evening mist. Under the setting sun, a bronze-colored neem tree stood tall in the canopy, and a starcrow was building its nest in the umbrella-shaped canopy. Occasionally, it would stop and stare at the two uninvited guests with its beady black eyes. "It's so beautiful, Erwin. I can't get enough of it. This is our country." "Indeed, it's more comfortable to be back in Erwin," the knight replied. Following a crow's caw, a flock of birds flew up from the forest. The sound of their wings flapping could be heard from miles away. A large animal passed through the forest. The knight turned around to warn the others behind him. But Borgnessen interrupted him. "Hey, don't change the subject. It's still far away." He patted his companion's shoulder. "Let's talk about you. You're not married yet, right?" "My goodness, poor old Pomed must be worried sick. So, have you taken a fancy to any lucky girl?" The knight glanced at him calmly. "Didn't I say that I won't think about it until I find out the truth?" Borgnessen's eyes widened. "You're making us blush with shame. You know that you're the only bachelor left among us. As for me, not only do I have a beautiful and kind wife, I might even have a daughter. Are you looking down on us?" "You're different," the knight replied. "You were already engaged before you left Erwin. I don't have so many restrictions." "That's not a restriction," Borgnessen corrected his companion's incorrect view. The knight shrugged. Borgnessen was silent for a moment before he became serious. "But have you thought it through, Pomed? We've made almost no progress in the past 10 years. The matter that the Marshal asked us to investigate in private is not simple. You have to think about it carefully. 1,000 years have passed since the War of the Holy Saints. Even if Lady Martha really left us some clues, they may have been erased by time. Haven't you noticed that we can't move an inch after returning to Erwin? If what your highness saw is true, then no matter how difficult it is, someone has to persevere, right?" The knight reached out his hand and clawed into the distance. "For this beautiful scenery to continue to exist, for everyone's tomorrow to not be meaningless, everything is to change that predetermined fate. Can mere mortals really change anything? Is Lady Martha joking?" Borgnessen smiled bitterly. "Haven't you noticed that Her Highness doesn't seem to believe in this either? In fact, I think it's more reliable to unite with the Silver Folk. Her Highness may have other ideas. You should have noticed that." She's a very opinionated person, and now she's the empress of the cruise empire. Perhaps in her opinion, those decisions about the past were indeed a little hasty. Even if it's Lady Martha, she dares to question it, the knight replied. But we're different. Borg Nesson shook his head. We have to believe in the Marshal's judgment. Do you? Of course, he replied without hesitation. The Marshal has never been wrong. The Marshal already has a descendant, the knight replied. He was born in Braggs 2 years ago. It's his grandson. Then I must beg the Marshal to betroth my daughter to this boy. According to the agreement, he's the next heir of the Cardoloso family. Just like the Marshal, he must be a genius. The knight shook his head. However, he was happy to see that the topic had been changed. Let's get down to business. Borg Nesson saw that his colleague was not in a good mood and knew what he was thinking. He changed the topic. Don't you think it's strange? It's a little strange, the knight replied. Yes. Our investigation first started in the Alcash area, and the investigation was limited to crews. But why did all the clues point to Erewhon in the end? 1,000 years ago, this place was clearly not a barren land, right? But perhaps in an earlier era, there were traces of civilization here. Have you ever been to the Loop of Trade Winds? Are you talking about the Druids? Perhaps even earlier. Borg Nesson frowned. That still doesn't explain the other problem. Why do all the clues seem to be cut off here? We know that the Flame King asked the late King Eric to bring the sacred sword of fire to this land, but everything that happened 700 years ago is like a legend. There are no written records at all. Perhaps there are, but it's not in our hands. What do you mean? The knight pointed at the ground. The cultists. Are you talking about those bastards we just slaughtered? But that's just a coincidence. Why would you suspect these people? It's not a coincidence, the knight replied. I've checked the files of the Holy Cathedral and found that their activities in Erewhon are much more frequent than we thought. So what? Do you still remember where we were 15 years ago? Borg Nesson's expression changed. He seemed to recall that nightmare, the endless pursuit, walking on the edge of death, poisoning, framing, and all kinds of conspiracies. He did everything he could to get away with it. That nightmare happened in Cruz, and it was probably one of the experiences he did not want to recall in his life. You mean the East Mets? The tree herders preserved a complete organization there, which is extremely rare in other places. I've carefully checked the local history of Metz for the past 30 years and found that the cultists' activities there are very similar to those in Erewhon. What does that mean? Do you still remember what they were looking for? You mean those strange stone pieces? That piece of stone came from Alcash about 30 years ago, Lucien explained. Borg Nesson felt as if he had been stabbed by a foot. Why didn't you say so earlier? Did someone else bring something else out of the Holy Cathedral? Did someone else enter the underground Holy Cathedral other than us? But how is that possible? The knight did not answer the question. Borg Nesson scratched his head. Why didn't you tell the princess back then? Maybe the tree herders wouldn't have taken the stone piece away in advance. Now those guys might have fled north to Fanzan. What should we do? Have you ever wondered why the tree herders were able to get the information in advance under such circumstances? Only you, the princess, and I know about the operation, the knight asked. You suspect the princess? I'm suspicious of the black dragons around her. Borg Nesson was silent. You think those stone pieces are clues? It's just a possibility. The knight answered. Also, those stone pieces don't exist alone. There should be another one in Metz, and the rest are in Erewhon. In Erewhon? Borg Nesson exclaimed in a low voice. How can you be sure? The cultists told me themselves. Didn't I just say it? Borg Nesson frowned. I know that there are 2 stone pieces in Metz. The captured tree herders admitted it themselves. But it's just your guess about Aween. Isn't it too hasty to confirm this based on the frequency of the cultists' activities here? Don't our investigation leads to Erwin too? Borg Nesson was silent. That's not good news. This time, we don't have the princess behind us. Bad news is better than no news at all. But this time, we're more prepared than the last time. Well, let's imagine. This means that they might have been following the Holy Sword of Flame since the time of the late King Eric. This is not surprising. After all, these people are the pawns of the Twilight Dragon. But the question is, Borg Nesson said. What should we do? It's simple. Since the cultists have spent more time than us, we'll look for clues from them, the knight replied. Borg Nesson looked at him in shock. After a while, he slowly sighed and said, "You're really a genius, my friend, but this will be dangerous." Marshall's attendant knight and student, how can they be afraid of danger? Borg Nesson replied. I think your idea will work. Why don't we divide the work now? How? Borg Nesson continued. The cultists active in Erewhon are mainly the All for One and the Tree Herders. These 2 organizations are at odds with each other, so it's best for us to investigate them separately. I have a preliminary idea. All for One will be in your hands, and the Tree Herders will be in mine. The knight looked up and silently glanced at his companion. Borg, although All for One is better at disguising themselves, the Tree Herders are much more organized. According to our strength. Stop, Borg Nesson hurriedly interrupted him. I'm his lordship's student. You have to let me do something, right? The knight was silent for a moment and nodded. The setting sun in Erewhon was slowly sinking below the Greyhill Mountains, and darkness gradually engulfed the earth. But the stars had risen, shining in the night sky. The Lionheart sword was born in the time of the late King Eric. 700 years later, the sword was once again in the hands of the descendants of the Lionheart king. Amandina silently looked at the sword in her hand. Since the sacred sword could no longer carry the ideals and bring light to this kingdom, then at least its power could not be in the hands of the Sassalds and lead this ancient kingdom to destruction. It was born of the sages and established this kingdom that carried the glory and oath. Then its destruction might be destined to give people the last hope. The cycle of history ended here. The sword was born because of Cypher, and it also died because of Cypher. She held the sword and decided to use this ancient family name to fulfill this promise. She raised the sword and a comforting smile appeared on her face. She looked up, and her bright eyes were like the light of a sword, piercing straight towards the despicable traitor. Makarov subconsciously took a step back. What are you doing? Put it down. Sadr had already realized that something was wrong. He suddenly shot out from his position, his pale claw-like hands curled up as he muttered an incantation. Purple lightning shot out from the necklace in front of his chest. But the power of the sword had already merged into the blood of House Cypher. In Amandina's inky black eyes, the needle of time was slowing down. She saw the traitor's eyes widen. The muscles on his face went from relaxed to tense. Then, he slowly opened his mouth and revealed his teeth. Every detail was clear to her. He slowly raised his hand like a dying old man and placed it in front of his chest bit by bit. This simple action seemed to have taken a century. Wizard Sadr opened his fingers, and lightning extended from his fingertips bit by bit. It did not look like quick light, but more like paint that had been knocked over. Purple and silver mixed together and slowly soaked into the canvas, moving forward inch by inch. The whole world seemed to be frozen. Amandina saw the chair that Sadr had knocked over seemed to be suspended in the air. The 4 legs of the chair were lifted off the ground and slowly tilted in the air. A book called Manual's Botany was lifted off the table and fell to the ground in a visible trajectory. The process was extremely slow. She then lowered the sword behind her. The sword in her hand slowly swung backwards, and then drew an arc from bottom to top. When the arc returned to its original position, the sword flew out of her hand. Makarov did not react at all. Sorcerer Sadra's mouth opened and closed as he chanted, but he suddenly stopped. The fury on his face gradually turned into shock, and his hand stopped moving. A bright white line was reflected in his eyes, and it passed by him. Makarov did not react at all. That second was divided into countless moments. But only one white light pierced through the center of the room. It pierced through Makarov's chest without any resistance. Time resumed its normal flow. Sadr turned around and saw the pure and flawless sword light cut open Makarov in front of him. The traitor did not even have time to cry out. His expression of fear, unwillingness, pain, and regret froze in the last moment, and then he melted into a pure white flame. Some of them had the chance to go down in history and be remembered by the people of Awin. But he chose a different path. This path led to his final death in the flames. After the Lionheart sword pierced through the traitor of the royal faction, it continued to move forward and hit a metal astronomical instrument on the desk. Under Sadra's shocked and angry gaze, the sacred sword of Erewhon was broken like glass. The blade broke into countless small fragments and flew in all directions. No! He roared, and his hair stood on end. The anger in his heart almost burned the entire lighthouse to ashes. He seemed to see the illusion of the twilight dragon in front of him, looking at him with a cold smile. Behind it was the destruction of the Sausalts. And the end of the world. No! Sorcerer Sadr screamed again, his heart aching. He couldn't understand how a saint's sword could be broken so easily. And even with the power of the Silver Folks, there was nothing they could do to save him this time. The Lionheart sword did indeed hide a secret that no one knew. But it was a legend that only the descendants of House Cypher knew. The purple lightning struck Amandina at the same time. The power close to that of a sage almost tore the girl's mortal body apart in an instant. It was a story about faith and dignity. Although it was weak. But it was destined not to be manipulated by fate. No matter what it took. The choice of the humble was like the sword in the girl's hand. It was better to die in glory than to live in dishonor. Amandina closed her eyes. But death did not come for a long time. She heard a gentle voice in her heart, calling out to her sleeping consciousness. Annie, you've grown up. In the room. Sorcerer Sadr looked at the scattered fragments of the holy sword in shock. They gathered together and surrounded the human girl under the convergence of an invisible force. Sorcerer Sadra's power, as well as the power of all the elements and laws in the room, was swept away by this invisible force. A man and a woman, two figures flashed into the room one after another. She looked at him coldly. As if looking at a dead person. Chapter 15:13. When Amandina slowly opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a strange place. Where is this place? Am I not dead? She raised her hand hesitantly, slowly reaching for her cheek and pressing it, as if to confirm that she was not a ghost. In the distance, there was an endless basalt surface that stretched as far as the eye could see, and densely packed square mountains were stacked in layers. Green lightning shuttled through the clouds, and the strong wind blew her long hair, forcing her to use her hands to push back the hair that was blocking her eyes. She raised her head, lifted her tattered skirt, and walked barefoot. She hesitated for a moment, but still walked forward resolutely. Dust and sand flew up in the wind, rolling over the girl's skirt. In the midst of the sandstorm, there was only a lonely figure, staggering forward step by step. It was a vast and endless plain. In the cramped study, the fragments of the holy sword flew up from the ground one by one. Like sand in the wind, they flew up and circled around Miss Amandina. Brando, holding the holy sword Odorfice, was staring coldly at Wizard Sodra. Beside him, Freya clenched her fists so tightly that they were almost bloodless. She gritted her teeth and glared at the silver person wizard with red eyes. They were supposed to be the guardians of order, the bearers of the fire of civilization. Who are you people? Sorcerer Sodra looked at the two uninvited guests in shock and anger. Where were the guards? Where were the other wizard Sodra in the castle? He stretched out his hand, and the great crystal staff, which had been leaning on the side and had never been used before, flew out of thin air and fell into his hand. The aura of the young man in front of him made his scalp tingle. Could it be that he had met a young dragon king? He opened his 5 fingers, not daring to hold back, and pointed the great crystal staff in his hand at the two of them. Universe Singularity, Imprisonment. This 11th circle spell was the supreme achievement of spatial magic. A singularity universe containing trillions of star systems slowly unfolded in space. A gust of wind rose in the room, and books and miscellaneous items flew into the four-sided void, followed by tables, chairs, cabinets, and bookshelves. In the end, even the ceiling of the room collapsed. The bricks and tiles broke free from the restraints of the walls and converged into a torrent that was sucked into the void. But Brando only punched. He didn't even use the golden flame holy sword Odorfice. He just transferred the sword from his right hand to his left hand, then raised his fist, and punched into the singularity universe, breaking it into pieces like a rag. The fist went straight through the void, and to Wizard Sodra's great astonishment, it hit him hard in the lower abdomen. The expression that was fixed on his face was a simple 4 words. This is impossible. Thus, one of the 12 leaders of the Bugle Wizards, the Wizard King of Sarsard, only had time to let out a painful whimper, and his whole body flew out as if folded in half. He crashed into the wall behind him, and the bricks and stones shattered. Brendel did not say a word. He stepped into the cloud of dust and reached under the rubble. With a whoosh, he lifted the dusty sorcerer Sodra out of the rubble. He asked word by word, "Now, do you still think mortals are weak?" Wizard Sodra, whose face was bruised and swollen, screamed. The power of the sage, you are the Silver Dragon King Rudian, answer, wrong. Brando lifted the leader of the wizards up high, and then threw him hard to the ground. With a loud bang, the poor wizard king flew out like a rubber ball, smashing everything in his way into pieces. Fortunately, he was a silver person and in existence close to the sage, so he was not smashed to pieces. Even so, several bones were broken. Seeing this scene, even Freya couldn't help but let go of her hand. She had never seen Brando like this. Furious, cold, and merciless. But she didn't feel afraid at all. She only felt calm and warm. Because the anger in her heart came from the promise, which was the true pride of a man and a lord. Trampling on, Wizard Sodra spat out a big mouthful of blood before he got up from the ground, but he still didn't give up resisting. He reached out his hand again, and grabbed his grey crystal staff from 10 feet away. He knew that he had met a formidable opponent this time. His opponent's power level seemed to be higher than his own. He racked his brains but could not figure out who his opponent was. It was not the Silver Dragon King Luodi, but who else could have such power? Of course, even in the most absurd of hypotheses, Wizard Sodra had never imagined that the opponent was the princess's knight, Count Ranner, the lord of the Tonajal people, who was praised by the people of Erewhon. There was no other reason. It was just a mortal. But this mortal was destined to give him an unforgettable memory on this day. First, it was Amandina. Now, it was her lord. Sodra calmed down. After all, he had been through hundreds of battles, and had even faced the man who made him tremble, the man called the Dark Dragon Odin. He raised his grey crystal staff and read out the taboo words recorded in the most ancient of documents. Wind, lightning, fire, and ice formed behind him one after another. He stretched out his thin fingers and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Die, elemental calamity." This was a spell invented by a dragon called Calamity. The blue calamity, the elemental dragon. The 14th ring was the limit that all beings below the divine folk could reach. Forbidden spell. With the Sorcerer King's actions, even the ground within a few miles of the lighthouse trembled. The earth elemental was being sucked away. The ground from Winomar to Silman cracked, and the earth and rocks were overturned. The creatures that lived in the soil escaped from their nests in tens of thousands. The merchants on the road had no choice but to stop and watch this strange scene. A few miles away, the clouds in the sky gathered into a vortex. Wind and fire elemental were being sucked down from thousands of meters in the air, converging into a green pillar of light that surged towards the lighthouse below the vortex. The waves on Lake Valendon began to recede like a tsunami, revealing the bottom of the lake that was thousands of meters long. The water elemental was being sucked away from the physical world. The light of the four natural elements converged into a belt of light, slowly merging into the gray crystal of the staff in Sorcerer Sauder's hand. Each of these light belts was several miles long. From afar, they looked like intertwined clouds of various colors. And in the light of these colorful clouds, Sorcerer Sauder's expression was twisted and ferocious. Brando also took a step back and used his hand to block in front of Freya. No matter what, he was still one of the 12 leaders of the Bugas. Although he was not one of the strongest, he was not to be underestimated. And this 14-circle spell was the best explanation of the opponent's strength. Brando. Freya hid behind him and asked worriedly. But she saw Brando only shake his head gently. Her heart calmed down. Sorcerer Sauder had finished chanting the last spell. He raised his gray crystal staff. This was the second time in 1,000 years that he had cast this spell. He had seen this spell that was known as the most magnificent in the mortal world. Hundreds of miles of ice crystal storms, lightning and thunder, fire and wind that burned everything, and turned the entire Nestle swamp into ashes. The depths of his eyes reflected the color of fanaticism. The era where the Sassalds were restrained was over, and the Silver Folk would once again dominate the order of this land. Because only those who held such power were worthy of being called the true masters of Wonde. But he did not finally see the flame that ignited the deepest part of his heart. Because the flame was extinguished. The wind stopped. The elemental water dried up. The restless land calmed down. The fanatical expression froze on Sorcerer Sauder's face. Brando was also stunned. What was going on? He clearly felt that the magic in the space was rapidly disappearing, and the four elements that relied on it also lost their dependence. Brando, Freya suddenly pushed Brando's back and shouted, "Look at Amandina." He suddenly turned his head. The broken Lionheart sword was broken into a total of 27 pieces. At this moment, they were circling around Amandina, and when each piece circled around her, a faint silver rune appeared. Every time the silver rune shone, a basic law was extracted from this space: magic, elements, destruction, restraint. They are disintegrating Sorcerer Sauder's forbidden spell. Freya was almost in disbelief, but how can the Lionheart sword do such a thing? Brando frowned and shook his head. He suddenly realized something and looked pitifully at Sorcerer Sauder, who was kneeling on the ground with a dull expression, and then raised his head to look at the sky. There, the curling vortex of clouds had long disappeared, leaving only a clear blue sky. Brando replied softly, "Freya, that is not the power of the Lionheart sword." "Not the Lionheart sword?" He nodded. The young war god from Butchie looked at him in confusion. Brando silently reached out and held her cold hand. Freya was slightly stunned, but did not pull her hand away. There was a strange feeling in her heart, as if she could feel the gentleness in this man's heart at this moment. It was an unspeakable feeling. It was silent, firm, and everywhere. It was a mother's care for her child. After tens of thousands of years, even if she had left this world long ago, she still firmly guarded this place. Compared to this, the despicableness of the Caesardians was not worth mentioning. That is, Martha, in the sky. The slender silver thread was following the trajectory of the modern world and was being pulled out of this material world bit by bit. The magic power was being drawn out of Tiamat's network and was first stripped from the spell. Then, the elements followed the contract between the four elemental kings and their mother and fled in all directions, turning into the most basic particles of the universe. Finally, it was the material world. The basic structure of the world was collapsing. The bricks, wooden beams, scattered pages, tables, and chairs were blown away by the wind like sand. In the blink of an eye, the castle turned into a pile of silver-gray gravel. At this moment, countless Caesardians were shocked to find that they had forever lost the ability to cast magic. On Silman Avenue a few miles away, merchants were enthusiastically discussing the sudden earthquake. Although some of them still had lingering fears, after the strange phenomenon in the sky disappeared, most of them had returned to their posts. Only a middle-aged man in ragged clothes who looked somewhat down and out was still frowning, silently watching the water not far away. The water was shaking slightly. Aftershocks, he muttered. But the shaking was becoming more and more obvious. Some stones danced in a strange and rhythmic dance on the street. The people in the shops on both sides of the street cursed and ran out again. But this time, the people were orderly. They even found something to cover their heads so that they would not be hurt by falling objects in the panic. The people stood on the street, waiting for the aftershock to pass again. But the ground shook violently. Most of the people were thrown to the ground in an instant. The middle-aged man turned around and supported himself with one hand on a nearby tree. He turned his head and saw a few grey-robed Seville Silver Lily followers with dull expressions. Strong magic reaction, this is. Divine weapon reaction. I'm afraid it's more than that. In the crowd, a heart-wrenching scream suddenly rang out, "Look, Martha is up there, look over there." Everyone turned to look in the direction he was pointing. Then, everyone felt their hair stand on end. In the distant horizon, a pure white beam of light. It shot from the bottom to the top, straight into the clouds, and above the clouds, there was a huge hand of light that gently caught the beam of light. Everyone's mouth was wide open, and they could not say a word for a long time. A few followers of the Silver Lily kept crossing themselves in front of their chests. Their hands were trembling a little. Martha, Lady Martha. It was the reunion of a mother and her children after 12,000 years. At that moment, many people actually started to wail loudly. The wind and sand formed a pillar. Once again, Amandina tripped and fell on the hard rock. A layer of skin was scraped off her palms and knees, and blood was dripping. But she did not say a word. She gritted her teeth and silently got up, trying to grab a sharp rock nearby to stand up again. But a hand appeared in front of her. Amandina raised her head in surprise. In front of her, a woman stood in the soft white light. She could not even see the woman's face clearly, but strangely, she subconsciously felt warm and peaceful in her heart. The pursuit of ideals and beliefs is a long and difficult process. The woman smiled and stretched out her hand to her, saying, "What can truly lead to the final throne is not an external object, but a firm and unchanging belief. You are. Don't you plan to continue moving forward, brave child?" Amandina gritted her teeth, nodded, and grabbed the woman's hand. She stood up. Looking back, the wind and sand that had filled the sky above the boundless basalt plains had already dissipated at some point. From afar, she could see many people on the grey plains. Like her, they were trekking in the same direction. Amandina's mouth was slightly open. "Is this the kingdom of the dead?" The woman smiled slightly. "For those who pursue the truth, what's the difference between life and death? The girl looked at her in confusion. I once knew your father, Amandina. Looking at the girl's eyes widened in surprise, the woman said gently to her. I know everyone who pursues hope. And your father's biological brother is perhaps the one you should be most proud of. You may not understand what kind of hope Mr. Borgnessen left for you. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.